I couldn't. I love the night. That's the only time I feel really alive.
That's what David wanted.
Blood, I was to find, was a necessity as well.
A vampire in love with a slayer. It's rather poetic. I am the monster that breathing men would kill. I am Dracula.
Good evening, my fellow vampire lovers. The sun is going down, and you know what that means. It's time for me to record another episode of my podcast, The Beautiful Dead. As always, I'm your host, Lena Nazari, and if you are not following me on Instagram at The Beautiful Dead Podcast, whew, boy, are you missing out. Because it is the last weekend of September, and man, did I save a good one for last. Not only that, but right now, today, when this episode drops, it is my birthday, and I am running around the French Quarter with some of my favorite people, and you have missed me going live, posting pictures, posting reels, showing you everything I'm doing down in the French Quarter. Boy, oh boy, and I am really hoping it is decorated for spooky season. I'll be kind of bummed if it isn't. If it isn't, I may be down there decorating and you're missing it on Instagram. So up until now, we've talked about Jack's book, Interview with the Vampire, the Devil, Witches, and what a ride it has been. But I want to get back to what this podcast does best, which is vampires. Oh yeah. What are we doing the next month, though? That's the question, because that's October, right? That's the juicy time. That's October. That's when people are looking for the spooky stuff. They want something they can sink their teeth into. They want to know what blood tastes like. Okay, let's talk about it. In October, I am bringing some of my coolest friends onto this podcast to talk about vampires. Today is the start. So right now, I am talking with my friend Marc. And we are giving you a college level lesson on the real history of vampires to prepare you for all the decades that we are going to talk about in October. So we're going to go all the way back to the earliest known vampire history and go all the way up to 1958. Why 1958, you ask? That's because every weekend in October, I have a different co-host who's going to come on, and we're going to talk about the best vampire movies, TV shows, not podcasts. It's before the time of podcast. We're going to talk about the best movies, TV shows, books, and music, vampire related, broken down by decades. We're going to do 1960 to 1979 with Tony from Hack the Movies, 1980 to 1999 with Jacob Givens from Waterproof Records, 2000 to 2019 with some of the coolest vampire people I know down in the French Quarter. I'm probably recording it as you're watching this episode. And then the last weekend, we're going to talk about 2020 to now and looking ahead with, well, you have to come back to find out who I'm going to be talking to the last weekend of October to celebrate Halloween. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the teasing and get to tonight's recording because Boils and Ghouls, it is a long one. Now, make sure you have your glasses on, your thinking caps, you're taking notes because, again, I'm going to tell you, college level history lesson. Why is it college level, you ask? Because Marc is the professor for the vampire class at University of Pittsburgh, and you guys all know yours truly has a doctorate, so we're about to get very nerdy. Take some notes, comment down below what you learned today that you did not know prior about vampires. Then come back next week for me and Tony from Hack the Movies talking about 1960 to 1979 and all of our October decade reviews. And what decade do you think brought us the best of vampires? All right, well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. For anybody who doesn't know you, would you introduce yourself and just tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, my name is Marc Wisnosky, and I'm a professor at the University of Pittsburgh in the Slavic department, or the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures. I never know why that's plural, literatures, but it is. And I have been teaching a few courses over the past 15 years or so, but uh, the only one I've been doing lately is the course called Vampire, Blood, and Empire, which is a very awesome sounding class until you get the workload. And then there's a lot of reading. But yeah, so we've got a bunch of well, we got 3 sections of that course, and currently there are some other people who are teaching the other sections of the course. I just do one of them. And yeah, I know a lot about vampires.
Yes, which is amazing. So people don't know, but the way that you and I connected is I was doing a vampire panel in Philadelphia. And when I was done, someone came up to me and said, "You should teach the vampire class at Pitt." And I'm like, "What?" I had been in Pittsburgh 18 years in academia. I went to Carlo and never heard of the class. So I came back, found the course catalog, found your name, blindly emailed you and said, "I promise I'm not a weirdo. I'm just so intrigued." And I'm so glad that we got to meet up and talk. And now you're coming on the
Yeah.
podcast. It's very cool. So do you go by Dr. Mark or Father Mark or just
Mark is fine.
okay?
That's just Mark.
Perfect.
Yeah, I guess I should add that I'm also an Orthodox Christian priest. So some people think it's a little bit strange that a priest would teach a class on vampires.
You're wild!
But when you understand vampires, it's not so strange. In fact, maybe we'll get a chance to talk about some of those connections.
Absolutely. And we talked about this too, because being somebody in the professional medical world and then also having this, people are often shocked that I would be so far into what they see as being fictional lore and fantasy, and then also so rooted in fact. But as I said to you, first off, a lot of medicine came from superstition and lore and things like that. But as we know, going all the way back, science and religion and superstition all sort of came from the same vein. So I think that it's not weird at all to have a foot in each world.
Yeah.
But we'll get to
Well,
that.
thanks for having me. I'm excited for our conversation.
Yeah, this will be fun. So I thought leading into spooky season, leading into October, I am doing every weekend, I have a guest on, and we are doing the greatest, in our opinion, vampire material to come out of the decades. And so we're starting sort of late in the 1960s. And I thought, wouldn't it be fun to have Mark on and we can give sort of a history lesson to help people understand how do we get to where we're at? How do you get from the things that go bump in the night to Christopher Lee's Dracula and all of that stuff? So I thought, wouldn't that be great to bring Mark on and we can talk about that? So let's go ahead and delve in because we have lots to talk about.
All right.
Going all the way back to pre-Christian
As far back
times.
as we possibly could.
As far back as we possibly could. So we started out our notes talking about Mesopotamia, and that was the Lilu. And you had mentioned, the Lilu really are more demonic creatures as opposed to vampiric creatures, which I completely agree with you.
Yeah.
The reason I mentioned them is because of how many people frequently bring up Lilith when talking about vampires. And, the Lelam and the Lilu and Lilith are all tied together. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the Lilith story is an interesting one because it's been around for a long time. But there's no historical attestation for it. Like, for example, it's not like if you go through the Bible, Lilith is mentioned, right? Lilith's nowhere in there, even
Right.
though according to mythology, she would be, right? She would
Correct.
be Adam's first wife, I guess, right?
Right.
Or something like that. But there definitely has been, she shows up for a long time. And so it's not a surprise that we would start to see offspring, right? And things like that. Yeah.
Well, and I think it's interesting too, because if you read about the Lilu, for people who don't know, these were these creatures that would come and sort of seduce you in your sleep and suck out your life force, which we know now is the incubi and the succubi, which are often tied into vampires in the fact that they drain a life force,
Right.
whether it be vital fluids or the life force itself, that idea that it will come in and it will sort of suck you dry. But like you said, these are not reanimated corpses. These are not things that were ever living. These are sort of more spiritual. But we'll go
Right.
ahead and throw them in
Yeah.
the mix for the
You
people.
know, this idea though doesn't quite go away. I mean, we see
Mhm.
it in other cultures. I think China has a, a kind of a spirit like vampire, and then the Germans had something called an Alp, which only would visit you in your dreams and would
Right.
suck your life force. So yeah, I mean, this idea is out there. It's not what we typically think of a vampire today, but
Right.
it's very adjacent.
Very
Vampire
adjacent.
adjacent, yes.
Yeah. And then if you go to like the modern day Buffy the Vampire Slayer, those vampires were actually demon possessed humans, that like the demon entered and sort of made the human soul, it's there, but it's now dormant and the demon took over. So that idea too, I always thought was a very interesting idea. But we
Yeah.
could probably talk about this all day, and this is just point one. So we're going
Yeah.
to go ahead and move on. And this is where I'm going to let you take the reins, because clearly this is your area of expertise. So to the people who don't know, I sent Mark just sort of my notes, just so he had an idea going into this, what my thoughts were. And I got some amazing notes back. And I wanted to talk about Greece and Rome, because they had their own, and we're talking ancient Greece and Rome. They had their own ideas. And we, I think, have talked on this podcast before about Empusa and Lamia, which
Mhm.
were, of course, women who were punished by one or more Greek gods or goddesses for doing something bad, and then ended up roaming the earth and drinking blood and things like that. And the Lamia, of course, is the half woman, half serpent, which makes me think a lair of the white worm, which I don't know if that was their where they got that idea. But then I started to mention the Vrykolakas. Is that how you say it?
I think it's Vrikolakas.
Vrykolakas.
Vrikolakas, yes.
Vrykolakas. So just,
Yeah.
I'm Irish, okay? You got to bear with me. So you have so many notes. So I want you to take
Yeah.
over and tell me all about this vampire.
Sure. Well, so that half woman, half snake idea, the Gorgons were half snake. So I wonder it might be related to that too. But Vrikolakas is a Greek, specifically Greek vampire that actually, as far as we can tell, probably was the influence for the vampires in Eastern Europe as well, because their names are very similar. Like the Serbian Vukudlak kind of feels like Vrikolakas. It's got that same sort of sound to it, and so there's been some speculation that there is maybe a linguistic connection, but we'll get into that as we go. So the Vrikolakas is kind of like the vampire that you think of when you think of old vampires. I don't know what people think about when they think about old vampires. I think about revenants, bodies that have come back to life and just roaming around. In the stories, the revenants always bother their families first, their friends second, and then whoever else happens to be around third. And there's even a story about a woman who complains because her husband, who was dead, kept coming back to bother her because he wanted his shoes. And so she gave him the shoes. And then there's another one who complained because the husband came back because he wanted sex, and she just couldn't handle it anymore. And these are kind of strange things, but the idea is that the person died, and then they somehow came back to life and bothered people. No one is ever really sure why.
Mm-hmm.
Or how, but nobody cared. There's no like, what's the mechanism of reanimation? That nobody asked that question. Well, I guess that's not true. People did ask that question because the church had to step in and give some rules. So we're talking now probably like the 1200s. So definitely, Rome has fallen. The Eastern Roman Empire is still going, but not for much longer. In Constantinople there, and the Vrikolakas is in the popular mind this vampire. And I think it's good to understand that the context. So in the Greek islands, even to today, when someone dies, their body is buried, and then after so many years, 4, 5, 7 years, their body's dug up again, and they don't have that much space. So cemeteries are small. They take the bones out and they put the bones in something called an ossuary, which is like a bone house. And in fact, if you've ever seen pictures of them, they're often organized. Like femurs are in one section, tibia, fibula, skull, and in monasteries they'll even write on the bones who they belong to, or they'll write on the skulls, and they keep them all there. And the tradition of let's say having reverence for the bones of the dead can go back to the early Christians who were forced to worship in the catacombs among the dead, but not just that. The saints, the people who died because they were Christian. So it became the norm in the Christian church up in, before the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s anyway, that the mass or the liturgy would always be celebrated on the bodies of the saints. And the way that would be is there would be a little piece of bone or something that would be in the altar. Even today, Catholic churches and Orthodox churches have the bones of saints in the altars, or in a cloth laid out on the altar, because it goes back to here. So that being said, this is not a strange practice within the culture of Greece, even to today. This idea of exhuming bodies and reburying, and then the idea happens, or I should say, what happens is if there's a monastery and they dig up a body of some wise elder, and the body has not decomposed, they're going to start to wonder why. And they're going to probably say, well, he must have been a very saintly man or woman. And this is a gift from God to show us, different, it could be for different reasons, but people come up with maybe the resurrection or, but anyway, the end goal of it anyway is that we have this person's body and we can see that it's not been corrupted or decomposed. And so typically that person will end up becoming named a saint. Now, what happens when you dig up a guy who was the town drunk and maybe he killed someone or was a rapist or something? He's not a saint. I mean, we can pretty much assume that. So what people would say then was, well, he was so bad that he was rejected by God and he's a vampire, Vrikolikos.
Mm-hmm.
So we get this Vrikolikos. But then the Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, steps in and says, no, there's no such thing as the Vrikolikos. There's no way that the body can be animated. Again, it's not something the devil can do. Only God can give life. So if you see this, it must be a trick of the devil or something. However, they do admit that there is a kind of a vampire, which they call a tympanios. And that first part of it, T-Y-M-P, is the Greek word for drum, like timpani, or your tympanic membrane in your ear, because when the bodies, because different things would happen, they might dig up the body and the body was swollen with gas, and so the skin was very tight, or the body had desiccated and the skin was very tight around the bones. So it was stretched tight like a drum, is what tympanios basically means. And the argument there was that the tympanios maybe was rejected by God. And so they would say the funeral and rebury the person, and usually next time they dug them up, they were fine. So that the Greek Orthodox Church said tympanios this is okay, we believe these to be real, but the Vrikolikos, we don't. Now, the problem comes in that the villagers, they don't care about the tympanios because the tympanios doesn't do anything.
Mm-hmm.
But the Vrikolikos does. The Vrikolikos, breaks into your house at night and drinks your wine. Or the Vrikolikos, harasses people in their sleep. So the people dig up suspects, and if the suspect shows signs of blood, or their hair and nails have grown, which of course they didn't, they simply the skin was pulled back, they would declare, oh, it's Holocaust, and then they would do certain things. I like to think of it as like there's an order, right? First, you say some prayers and rebury him, and if the problem persists, then you take the heart out and burn it. And if the problem continues to persist, you cut the head off. And then if it gets really bad, you just burn the whole body. But cremation, the cremation of human remains, is completely not allowed by Christian tradition. So it was an offense, both ecclesiastical within the church, but also often within the government as well. You couldn't burn a body. It was just considered to be desecration. And so we have tales. Well, they're more than tales. They're literally accounts by people who were traveling who wrote about what they saw, saying, like they dug up this body and they did all this stuff to it. And the last line is often something like, I only witnessed this. I have nothing to do with it. Like, I promise I was not involved, because they don't want to get in trouble for the desecration of the body. So it's a really interesting phenomenon. And what I think is interesting, how it connects to vampires more generally, is that this was going on for hundreds of years in the Greek islands, but it's not until the 1800s, 1700s, 18th century that Western, usually Jesuit missionaries go to the Greek islands. They go to places in modern day Turkey or Serbia, and they see this phenomenon and they're like, what are these people doing? And they write about it and they send the letters home, or they write a book in the case of Tournefort, who I think is on our list. And people read it and they're like, whoa, and it starts to freak people out. And then vampire hysteria takes over.
Yeah. And when you said Serbia, that was the first thing I thought of, because the big issue in Serbia where government had to get involved and everything. And so how does the church eventually get control over this? Like, stop the villagers from digging up and desecrating bodies?
Well, they don't. I mean, not really. They try though. So in some cases, the local priest or the monks, they're right in with everybody else and they're involved in the whole thing. But eventually the Greek Orthodox Church puts out a special law, something called a nomocanon, which is just, it's like a local law. And this is in 1867. So this is how recent this is. And in it, it's the title of the particular canon is called On Those Who Burn Vampires. And I'll read to you what it says in there. It says, those who burned the Holocaust and were soaked in their smoke, the smoke of the burning, right, should not receive communion for at least 6 years. So they're excommunicated, literally, no communion, because here's why: people were using the bodies of the Holocaust in divination and trying to prophesy the future too. Right. So that is another level of badness. You're not supposed to, divinize. And so that's another problem. And if you are caught doing this, then, you get excommunicated. If you're a clergyman, I think you get stripped of your office. So you're kind of kicked out. Now there's other canons, which I forgot to include, but there are other ones that say that basically you cannot allow this to happen as the priest or whatever, probably the priest in the village. Like, you're not supposed to allow people to dig up the bodies and do all this stuff to it. But how much power these parish priests in Greece were usually pretty uneducated. They could do the services and stuff like that, but they didn't really preach or anything. There were people who traveled and did that who were educated. So the local priest probably could easily be overpowered by everybody else. But in theory, he's supposed to say, don't do it. And say some prayers. Got to do prayers. Lots of prayers, memorial services for the dead. And hopefully that will work.
It's a lot of pressure on one person.
Yeah. I mean, there is. Funny enough, there is another law that we have that's commented on. So there's this really big book, and I don't have it with me right now. In Greek, it's called the Pedalion. In English, it would be like the rudder of a ship. And it's a book of like laws, but it's more like a rudder. It's more for guidance than anything else. And in this, there's a long discussion of how to identify the Vrikolikas. This is like a serious piece of theological explanation, but they talk about here's if you see these things in the Vrikolikas, here's what here's what to expect: the long fingernails, etc. But then it ends with like, this isn't real, so like don't believe it. It's not like what you're seeing is not what you think you're seeing.
Yeah.
And for the educated people who are reading this book, they're like, yeah, of course, I get it. Especially when you do funerals all the time, like as a priest or something, you know what dead bodies look like. But regular folks, that's where the problem is. They're not sure. They get all hyped up about it and they get scared. And then it becomes a mass hysteria event, essentially.
Oh, 1,000%. It's funny that you say that because I'm currently doing research on witches for the spooky season episodes, specifically witch trials, and how does something like that happen? How does it get that bad? And that your book reminded me of that Hammer of the Witches. What was that? The Malleus Maleficarum?
No, yeah.
That was like, this is how you recognize a witch. This is how you capture her, and this is how you kill her. And
Right.
people are like, this is fact. This is what
Yeah.
we're going to live by, and this is the thing. And it's just a guy who wrote a book. Like,
Right. Well, I know we'll get to this in a few minutes, but the Serbian stuff, one of these Jesuit priests who visits the East and writes about vampires is a guy named Leo Lacius. And he is an authority because he wrote this commentary on the Bible in the 1700s, and like even people like Voltaire recognize this man is an academic authority. But then he writes a book about like the supernatural, and Voltaire's like, wait a second, this is crazy stuff.
hold up.
But regular people who read it are like, it must be true because this guy's an expert, and now there's vampires everywhere, and they're out to get us.
Interesting. Yeah. So we've talked about this, but long before I knew I had a science brain, I was doing research. And so as a high schooler who watched Bram Stoker's Dracula, this becomes my new obsession. And so I start doing the vampire research when you had to go to the public library and find the books and do the research and all that stuff. And so, of course, you tap into Romania and Transylvania right out of the gate. But it's not until you get into the Serbian stuff where you're like, wow, that's where it was really going down, was in Serbia,
Right.
which we will get to here in a minute. But I don't want to jump the gun. Are you good with the Greek stuff? Do you have
Yeah,
anything you wanna add?
we'll come back to it with
Okay.
the Serbian because Greece and Serbia are
Yeah.
next to each other.
Totally. And we're going to get to that, but I just wanted to mention one more from
Yeah.
our ancient section here, and that was the Egyptians. And so while doing all of my research, I fell upon Sekhmet, which I thought was a very interesting goddess, not just because of her connection to vampires, but because I did not know she's the goddess for doctors and healers, which is very interesting. So she's the goddess of the sun, which is interesting if she's tied to vampires, plague, chaos, war, but also healing. So like, okay.
Yeah, you can see.
Okay, so again, this is one of those times where the gods were angry at the people, so they had to do something about it. So instead of it being Zeus, now it's Ra, the big boy in Egypt. And so he creates Sekhmet to try and get the humans in line, specifically the humans that aren't listening to him and doing what he's asking of them. And so she's depicted as having this sort of lioness face with the body of a woman, and well known for her love of the taste of blood. So many people believed that if you got on her good side, she would heal you and bless you. And if you got on her bad side, she was going to show up and she was going to drain you dry. And so her temples, often they would bring bowls of animal blood to give her for offering, to try and kind of get on her good side. And then hopefully she's going to heal you from your leprosy or whatever they had going on back then. But I just thought that would be an interesting one to talk about, how they kind of were popping up all around this idea of like, if you're bad, something is going to come drain your blood. Long before they even truly understood what blood did, they knew that you needed it to be alive. So I just thought that was interesting.
I mean, I'm pretty sure it's in the Old Testament, that line, "The blood is the life," which comes up again in Dracula. But
Dracula.
you
Yep.
know, but it's not like Bram Stoker pulled it out of nowhere. I mean,
Yes.
it's been around, right? This idea that they knew that if you didn't have any blood, you would die.
You were done.
Um,
Yeah.
they might not know exactly how it functioned.
Or where it
Uh,
came from or how you made new blood, but they knew you needed it.
yeah,
Yep.
yeah. So
Interesting. But like, we have the healers we do today because people just kind of figured stuff out. I say it all the time, if you look at the ancient maps of chi that the Chinese had, if you look at those rivers of chi on the body, it lines up with the central nervous system. So they were kind of figuring it out long before. And even today, I mean, anybody who's in medicine will tell you it's still the practice of medicine. We're still figuring things out, but I thought that was interesting. So we're going to tap into part 2 now,
all right, part
which
2.
is vampires from around the world. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. It's what a lot of my panel is about when I go to different places, just because I think it is so fun how every culture has something like this, but they all sort of have their own thing. And so you've already mentioned this, but we're going to start with China, which is the Jiangxi, the hopping vampires. So they hop because the rigor mortis is set in. So their knees don't bend and their elbows don't bend. So they're kind of like Frankenstein and they hop instead of bending their knees, which I thought was kind of goofy once you know the way that they're supposed to move. And like you said, they don't steal blood, they steal chi. So that's that idea of like sucking out your life force.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, that's excuse me, that's common. I find a lot of ancient vampires. It's usually not blood. It's
Yes.
life force, right? But blood as a substitute for life force makes complete sense.
Of course.
You know?
Absolutely. But every time people start talking about life force sucking, it makes me think, of course, of energy vampires, which of course makes me think of Colin Robinson from What We Do in the Shadows. So have you seen that?
The TV show?
Yes.
I've only ever seen the movie because
Oh,
I cut the cord a
did you?
long time ago, and that's on the cord
Got it.
until they put it on Netflix.
So
and
fun.
I've wanted to watch it, but
Whenever you get to it, you'll have to text me
shame
and let
on
me
me.
know because
Yeah.
you will catch every joke. Definitely written for vampire nerds like us, but the characters are just
Yeah.
so well written. Okay,
Well,
let's
if
move
it's
on.
anything like the film, then
Oh,
yeah.
genius. Oh, all the same people, and we get good
Yeah.
cameos and stuff, but just genius. And a good breath of fresh air. You'll laugh. It's not too
Good.
heavy. So yeah. So next we have, this is one of my favorite ones that I love to tell everybody about, which is in the Philippines, we have the Manananggal, which is a beautiful woman who detaches the upper half of her body, sprouts wings, and flies out to go find unborn children or the blood of pregnant women, which is horrible, but it's okay. Because if you manage to find her lower half and sprinkle garlic or salt on it, she can't reattach and she'll die. It's very specific and dark.
Yes. Yes.
Very.
That totally makes sense. I mean, the blood, unborn children and pregnant women, there's a lot of life there, right? If you're looking for life, that's the place to go.
Totally.
Yeah.
Absolutely 100%. And I think it's the Philippines. They have one same thing, but this is like an old woman that detaches and her like guts are hanging out. So the way to protect yourself from her is you stick like a thorny branch or thorns or something in the window. And so when she tries to fly in, her entrails get stuck and then she dies in the sun. It's very specific.
All right. Well,
Very specific. I
that's
think we
good.
kind of get off easy with our vampires, like a good old cross, a stake to the heart. Ugh. So then we have Spain, which is the guaxa. I love the guaxa because it's a little bit goofy looking. If you look up pictures, it is a vampire, much like what we expect, right? It drinks blood, a reanimated corpse, except instead of two elongated canines, he has one long, sharp tooth right in the front. Just one. Not even two like Nosferatu, just one sharp little tooth there.
Like Carmilla.
Like, there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, a little silly,
Mm.
In Africa, we have the Ramanga, and the Ramanga again drinks blood, but he got a hankering for something special, which is the toenail clippings of the noble classes of royalty.
Well,
So gotta watch out
it's
if
like chips, vampire chips.
you're. Now we're getting into my territory, which is Scotland and Ireland, and I think they have the best vampire stories. So in Scotland, they have the Beavon Sea, and the Beavon Sea are these beautiful women who come out of the woods at night and lure men into the woods through song or whatever they do. And they always have these long, beautiful dresses, and that is to cover their hooven feet. And they lure the men into the woods and then, of course, drink their blood and kill them. So the thing I always say in my panel is, gentlemen, if a beautiful woman randomly comes out of the woods and says, come here, big boy, it is not your lucky night. Don't follow her.
Yeah, the Russians have the same thing called the rusalka. And she lives in the water, and then she'll go into the trees and like jump on you to attack you. However, if you're a young man, you can catch her and bring her home and make her your wife. However, there's a time of the year called Rusalnia, which aligns to the season of Pentecost in the Orthodox calendar. So in Pentecost, she is free to leave. She can go, and then you'll lose her. But you can catch her for about a year if you're a cook, if you're quick.
If you are so inclined,
Yeah.
bring a demon babe into your home.
Yep.
Get her to cook and clean for you. Just
right.
bad idea to me. I'm just saying. I mean,
I don't know.
So then we're going to get into Ireland. Now, do you know the story of Abertoch?
I don't know. I don't.
So I'm excited. Abertoch was told here's the story. I've heard several different versions, so I'm going to give you the summary and a nice little nutshell here. Abertoch was said to be this tiny village chieftain in Ireland. And when I say tiny, I mean like gnome-like. He's always told to be like a dwarf-like, gnome-like, horrible, gnarly old guy, very mean. This was what I wrote it down, 432 AD. So long time ago. He was just awful. He was so mean to his people. They were not living well. And he ends up being able, because of arranged marriages, to marry this beautiful woman who, of course, is not thrilled, but she's doing her wifely duty. She's trying to be a good woman. They have separate bedrooms because, that was the time. And he gets into his head that she's cheating on me. She's definitely cheating on me. So he climbs out of his window one night to go and try and peer into her window, and he falls, gnome-like creature, probably not the best of reflexes, falls to his death. The people are like, oh no. And then they bury him. Well, he shows up the next night, shows up in the great hall where they're celebrating and says, give me a bowl of blood. So the people are horrified, not just that he's back, but that he's dead and back. So he is now a horrible ruler. He's always begging for blood. He's even meaner to his wife. So one of the people says, we got to do something about this. So they go to a local village and find that chieftain. And they say, please come save us from our vampire chief. So the big guy, he's a warrior. He wants to do what's right. He comes over, he slays Abertoch, and they bury him. And the next night he comes back. So they slay him and they bury him again. And the next night he comes back. So after a few times of this happening, they find a magic man or a witch doctor or whatever they would have been called in the area. And he says, maybe druid. Yeah, that would line up. And he says, what you're dealing with is a vampire. So what you need to do is bury him upside down like that, and then put a giant rock on top. So to this day, that rock is still there. And if I can remember where it's at, I'll let you know, but you can go visit it.
Nice.
You can go visit the rock. And it is said that Abertoch is still under there alive upside down, which I shouldn't laugh, but also it sounds like he kind of deserved it. He sounds like bad dude, but
yeah, right.
It is rumored that Bram Stoker got a little bit of his idea about Dracula just from this local legend that he had heard growing up as a boy. The idea of a vampire that can come back and come back and come back. And there is a fabulous movie called The Boys of County Hell that is based on this Abertoch legend, where they, of course, like an idiot, move the rock and set the guy free. But there's a lot of wonderful jokes in there about Bram Stoker and how he's a plagiarist and all this stuff and how they should be famous, not him, but highly recommend that one. So that's Abertoch. That is a great old story that I've always loved.
Abertoch.
Yeah,
Nice.
Abertoch. Yeah. And then the Dirk Du, which I put in here. Again, beautiful woman who sort of lures you in. And the story is that she was, again, forced into a terrible marriage and either ended her own life or somehow was killed, possibly by her husband in a rage. And so she rose from her grave to seek vengeance on all the men, and she'll lure them in and drink their blood. I feel like that story is in every culture, right? Like the woman in white and all that stuff. But I thought I would throw it in there.
Sure.
So now what are your favorite vampires from different countries?
You put me on the spot there.
Oh,
I kind of like, okay, so I kind of have two separate ones. I like the Revenant, because I think it's just it's kind of like a zombie, really, more than a vampire. Although often they will drink blood. But I also like the Strigoi from Romania,
yeah.
because they can change shapes and turn into mist and wolves and bats, and
100%.
they're way more of the vampire we think of.
Yeah.
They're those are cool
Yeah.
too. So we're talking that now. Well, maybe we'll talk later about more modern vampires.
Yeah.
I've got some favorites in that
Okay, perfect.
realm too, but
Yeah, I thought I would make Eastern Europe sort of its own thing because
yeah.
no offense to anybody else, even my own Celtic people, but Eastern Europe has really got the best vampires. They really do. They've got the best vampires.
Especially because they're the vampires that have given us vampires, really. The vampires we have today are Eastern European and Greek.
Yeah, totally. 100%. Even like the Celtic vampires, if you really look into them, they almost feel fairy-like. They're a little bit fey. They're a little more of that like woman in white idea, whereas the Eastern European vampires are vampires with a capital V. That is what you're thinking of.
Yep.
So we'll move on. So this is where I want you to take over, because I thought I knew a lot about Serbia, but I think I should let you take over. So why don't you tell people about Serbian vampires, their history, because we have like actual written documentation of vampires in Serbia.
Yeah, this is great stuff. Well, okay, so the first vampire of East Central Europe that we have on record we have his name. It's Mislata, and he is often known as the Shepherd from Blav. And this was written in a manuscript in 1336. And they wrote in the manuscript like who it was who did it. So it was written by this guy named Philip, who was the son of the king of Majorca. And back then, just because you were from Spain, you might go to a monastery in what would today be Germany or wherever, because it was all kind of fluid and probably part of maybe the Holy Roman Empire at this point. Anyway, so Philip writes about how this certain Mislata guy died, and every night he would get up and he would scare people and kill people, and eventually they caught him and they impaled him. And he said, that hurt. That hurt. But you've given me something to fend off the dogs with, because he now has a stick to fight off the dogs who are trying to eat his dead body.
Okay, that's kind of badass.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
So eventually they burned him, because that's what you eventually had to burn him.
Yeah.
And at the time he swelled up like an ox and roared terribly, which we can see today probably being gases. But and then he died. Before that, at one point they put him on a cart after he was like dead, and he still was moving. and that
Yes.
caused them some problems. So this Shepherd of Blav, we're going back. Blav is like Bohemia, Western Bohemia, or Eastern Bohemia. If you have any geography ideas, so Blav is Bohemia, close to Eastern Europe. So it's in there, and the name Mislata sounds pretty Eastern European to me.
Yeah.
And then okay, this thing happens. I don't have the date for it right now, called the Treaty of Passarowitz. And essentially there's a war between the Austrian Empire, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or the Holy Roman Empire, depends on who's calling them what. Anyway, the Austrians and the Turks, the Ottoman Turks. And it's in the 1700s, early 1700s. And the Austrians win the war, and the peace is brokered by Great Britain. Just a little fact. And the idea is that Serbia is cut in half. So the Turks had Serbia, but now Austria has won back half of it. And the Austrians were really good at government ruling. So they sent out all these, functionaries to different towns to, hey, we got this new land. Let's go figure out what we got. And this is where vampires really, really start.
Yeah.
So first in 1725, there's one of these functionaries goes to a town, and he writes back, because these are all letters that are written back to Austria, to Vienna. And he writes about, there's this guy named Peter Blagojevich who died. And then he began to visit people at night, and he came looking for blood. He came for this and that. And eventually the villagers dug him up in the day, and his body was completely normal. And they said, oh no, right? Well, he's a vampire. So of course they staked him, and they burned him, and they scattered his ashes, because you have to do all those things. So Peter Blagojevich, there's one story. Then this one is probably my favorite. I'll set it up. So that the Holy Roman Emperor, or the Austrian Empire, depends on what you want to call it. At the time, I believe the emperor's name was Sigismund, and his field surgeon, for his army medical field surgeon, is this guy Johann Flickinger. And he sends Flickinger to this town to go investigate this crazy stuff, right? So essentially what happened was, there's this guy who we call, whose name is Arnold Paoli. And Arnold Paoli, he fell off a hay wagon and he died. And then he came back and bothered people. And eventually the villagers found his body, dug him up, and burned it, and killed him, right? 5 years later, 17 people are suspected of being vampires in the same village, and they're all tracing it back to Arnold Paoli. But Arnold Paoli has been dead, so they need to have an explanation for this, right? So I'm trying to pull up some of my notes on this, because it's too good.
And this was just right after Peter, right? It was just a couple years after Peter that
So
issue with Arnold.
Peter Blagojevich is 25. Arnold Paoli dies in 27, and then 5 years later, 32, is when the story gets back to Vienna, and they send Johann Flickinger to go check this out. And you can never find your notes when you want them, right?
Right.
So anyway, he well, maybe it's here. Oh, it's not here. Of course not. So Flickinger and 4 other doctors go to this town, and they investigate this. The people are digging up all of these suspected 17 bodies, and they're examining them, right? So first of all, they dig up this woman named Stana. She's 20 years old, and she died in childbirth, and both her and the baby were in the grave. And it's a doctor's report, right? So he writes, she was quite complete and undecayed. After the opening of the body, there was found in the cavitate pectoris, in the chest, it's Latin, right?
Sure.
A quantity of fresh extravascular blood. The blood vessels in the heart were not, as is usual, filled with coagulated blood. The blood was not coagulated. and the lungs and liver and spleen and intestines were quite fresh as they would be in a healthy person, he writes. However, the uterus was enlarged. I don't know, but she had died in childbirth, right?
Correct.
Then there's the second person is, so she's a vampire, check. So they're basically going vampire, not vampire. Vampire, check. Second woman is named Militsa. She's 60 years old, and she is patient 0 because when Arnold Paoli was a vampire and bothering people 5 years earlier, he drank the blood of cattle. And what happened was, several years down the road, they slaughtered the cattle. Militsa specifically slaughtered, I think they were goats, and she ate the goat meat. And this caused her to become a vampire.
So they're treating it like it's viral.
Basically, yes.
Yeah.
Like it was infected by this.
Interesting.
By this. I should also point out, or I should add, Arnold Paoli, after he died, people suspected he was a vampire because he told some of his friends that he had been going over to Turkish Serbia, the part that was in Turkey now, because there was a vampire there who used to bother him. And so he went to that vampire's grave and bathed in his ashes or something to try to break the curse, right?
Correct.
So they all assume, well, you did that, you're a vampire too now.
Now you caught it, like cooties.
Yes. Right. I mean, there is this idea that if you can somehow dig up the body and burn it and then put the ashes on yourself or something, it will protect you from the vampire from then on.
Yeah, in Romania, it's make bread with the ashes and eat the bread or drink it in water.
There you go. Right. So anyway, Miss Militsa, she is patient 0. She's the one who started the whole thing and passed it on to everyone else. The third is a baby who was, and this is what the doctor wrote. There was an 8-day-old child which had lain in the grave for 90 days and was similarly in a condition of vampirism, like not decayed after 90 days, which, I mean, who the heck knows what time of year this was, right? In Serbia, it could have been 2 degrees, right? There was a 16-year-old boy, and he was also in like state of vampirism. There was another guy of 17 who died after 3 days. So he definitely was a vampire, and his body was not decayed. There was another woman who died after a couple days, and this keeps going on. There's a whole list. There's 11, 12, 13. One of these girls, Stanichka, she complains that one of these other boys was bothering her, and then she got sick. They found him as a vampire, so then they dug her up and find out if she was a vampire too. But at the end of the day, they said, no, she's not a vampire. It didn't get her. And they just reburied her. The rest of the ones, they burned their bodies. But the ones, if they thought they weren't a vampire, they reburied them. And then at the end of this long letter, here's what the doctor writes. After the examination had taken place, the heads of the vampires were cut off by the local gypsies, because I guess the gypsies are outside the law, and burned. Right? They're like, go
ahead, excommunicate me. I don't care.
Right. They don't care. Yeah. So the gypsies do the dirty work, just like Dracula had them do. And then they burned the heads and the bodies, but you got to cut the head off first. And then the ashes were thrown into the Morava River. Okay. And the decomposed bodies of those who weren't vampires were reinterred in their own graves. And this is attested to by Johann Flickinger, officer of the regiment. So this letter was like, people believed it. I mean, it's not untrue, right? This is what he observed, because the name of the letter is Visum et Repertum, which means like seen and reported. So this is his report. But this, along with the story, which is written by this guy Leo Alasius, who was a Jesuit priest who wrote about Greek vampires, these come to Western Europe in, let's say, the early 1730s, and it begins what we academics like to affectionately call the vampire epidemic of the 1730s, because people start thinking there's vampires everywhere. Right. And I had mentioned Voltaire earlier. There's a quote by Voltaire, which he's mad at Alasius for remember I said Elacius was well known for his academic studies on the Bible, but now he writes this book on like creatures in Greece, and he's like, this is foolish. And Voltaire says the only vampires that we have in Paris or London are the lawyers and the stockbrokers. Like we don't, before 1830 there was no vampires, but now, now they're everywhere. Like that's how silly this is,
Yeah.
in his opinion.
Yeah.
Yeah, the lawyers are the vampires.
That's amazing. And that is
Yeah.
so similar to the Salem witch trials. If you go back and look at how it started and how the frenzy, it got to the point where they had locked up a 4-year-old girl and said, she's a witch. You're just like, what? It's that same mass hysteria. And if this must be true, then this must be true,
Yeah.
which means this must be true. And yeah.
Right.
Wow.
If A, then
yeah,
then
correct.
B.
Correct.
There's another good one that happens around the same time, and this one is in Greece, and it's reported by another Jesuit whose last name is Tournefort, Louis maybe, and I don't care. Anyway, he writes about going to the island of Mykonos, and the people there are freaking out because there's a vampire bothering the villages, and everybody came. And they spent the night in the village square, and all the rich people of the village went to their villas in other parts of the island, right? So all the poor people, or whatever, the villagers are there in the town square at night because they're afraid of this vampire. And when they go back to their homes in the day, they find that their homes have been ransacked, their wine has been drunk, as has their ouzo, and money's been taken. And it's all the vampire, right? Turns out it's some teenage kids who took advantage of this to go right.
Yeah.
Mass hysteria, a lot of empty wine bottles. So let's go for it. But anyway, Tournefort tells this whole story about how they took the body of the suspected vampire and they put him in like a shack. The local monks were burning incense. It was really hot. And everyone kept saying the body, he must be a vampire because it doesn't smell. And Tournefort is writing, actually, it smells really bad. But they're either in denial or it's the incense, they can't smell it. So they don't have anyone who's a medical at all person. They get the butcher. The butcher tries to take out his heart by going through his stomach because he doesn't know where the human heart is.
Right.
So they finally have to tell him where the heart is. They take the heart out and they burn it, and they still are afraid of him. So then they eventually cut off his head. Then they burn his body. Then they scatter his ashes. And Tournefort's like, this is crazy. And the people kept denying it. And the monks are like, no, he's a vampire, and there was no decay and all this other stuff. And Tournefort's writing as it happens, like, this is completely mad. There is decay. He stinks.
Yeah.
Then they get word that the bishop is coming to investigate it, and the monks flee because they know that they've been implicated in the burning of a body. So they run for the hills.
Yeah.
That's one of my favorites because those kids, I don't
That's
blame
hilarious.
them, right?
And when you look back on it, you think like, well, at that point in time, you need for it to be true, because if it's not true, you just desecrated a human body who did nothing as a man of God, and like you messed up. So you need for it to be true. So now you have to triple down on your stories. I mean, that is wild. And it's always so interesting to see somebody outside of the hysteria, what their interpretation is, because that's his perception, that's their perception, and somewhere in the middle is the actual reality of what's happening.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But I mean, just to finish with the Serbian vampires, because I know in our notes we talk about Sava Savanovic, but Sava Savanovic is a fictional character. So
I was gonna say that's like a legend, like a local urban legend. Yep.
We'll get to him maybe later, but
yeah.
But for the real vampires, so this is 1732. The vampire hysteria hits Western Europe. Western Europe knows nothing about vampires, at least in the sense that we do, but now they do.
Yeah.
To the point where I believe I have it written down here. The year 1748, 15 years later, we have the first poem by Heinrich Ossenfelder called Der Vampir, written in German. It's short. It's like 15 lines or something, from the vampire's point of view. And we see now the vampire has entered the popular imagination. It's now, it's no longer this myth or legend. We now have the fictional vampire.
Mhm.
And that opens up a whole different can of worms, as we will see.
Absolutely. And then it becomes that idea that we have now, which is, as the creator, I can do whatever I want with the vampire lore.
Right.
It's so open that you really can do whatever you want with it. And that's how it really starts to take off. So I just mentioned in here in my notes really quickly, Bulgaria, just because they're starting to unearth all those graveyards, which is so interesting. Archaeologists are starting to unearth these graveyards where you see, as far back as the 12th and 13th century, these burial practices saying, well, because this person lived this way or died this way or was, unfortunate enough to be a redhead, then we have to bury them with padlocks on their toes or iron stakes or
Brick in the mouth.
yeah, my favorite, the brick in the mouth. My favorite is the scythe over the throat. So if you try to sit up, you decapitate yourself. So it's wild. Just in the last few years, they've started to unearth these burial grounds where, for whatever reason, at the time of interment, you were determined that you were at risk to rise. And so they had all these things. The padlock on the toes, I always thought was so silly, but kind of fun. But the scythe on the neck is...
The Slavs are really interesting when it comes to how to deal with vampires. So they don't, because the Slavic people are on, almost all of them are Orthodox, like the Greeks. They have that you can't burn the body, right? So they're going to do whatever they can to avoid getting in trouble with like the church or whatever. So they come up with these practices like, well, any kind of creature in Slavic mythology can be kind of thwarted by counting. They have an impulse to count.
Yes.
So if you put sand in the coffin, it can't leave the coffin till it counts every grain of sand or
Right.
rice or something like that. And
Or
it just
seeds,
goes,
yeah.
it's normal, seeds, yeah.
Which that one we have not seen in a really long time. That
No,
one
no.
kind of went away, and we haven't
Yeah.
seen it in a really long time, but it was a very strongly held belief for a
Yeah.
really long time, and that's how we got the counts on Sesame Street, was because of that weird old legend that if you throw down rice, they will stop and sit down and start counting it, and you can get
Yes.
away.
No, it even shows up in like legends of there's that a Russian witch called Baba Yaga.
Yeah.
And Baba Yaga, she's actually more powerful than stuff. She'll have other people count for her.
Yeah.
But the counting has to be done.
Mhm.
For her, she likes to scatter flour because it's harder to count flour than it is seeds.
Mm.
But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Another thing is you can bury the body upside down because they're too dumb.
They'll claw down
Yeah, they'll
instead
go
of
down
up.
instead of up.
Yeah.
And then there's another, staking the body is
Yeah.
first and foremost, it's there to pin the body
It's
to the
to
ground.
trap them.
Right.
Yeah,
So
it
they
has
don't
nothing
come
to do
out.
with the heart. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like you're staking down a tent.
Yes.
And that's where they started. But so if none of that works, then you have to go to the next level, which is remove the heart, cut off the head, burn the body, scatter the ashes, preferably in running water.
So what I think is interesting as we're having this conversation is inevitably the lore grows to say that the one thing we have to do to save ourselves is the one thing we're not allowed to do, which is so interesting. It's like, is there just a human desire to break the rules that are in front of them? Like, does that somehow, I don't know. This is just me thinking out loud as we're talking, but yeah, I think it's interesting that eventually this lore grows that the only way to save my people is do the one thing I was told I'm not allowed to do.
Yeah, I never thought of it that way. That's
Yeah.
quite brilliant. Right? You've got to transgress the rules in order
I am
to
just going to clip you saying I'm brilliant, and I'm just going to use
and
that.
just loop it. Make a
Just
meme
gonna
or
loop
whatever
it.
those things are.
I thought that was interesting. So now we're going to get to the one we both love, which is Romania.
Yes.
Good old Romania and the Strigoi.
Yeah.
So I always thought it was interesting that we have the Strigoi or the Strigon in Romania, which is so close to the Striga, which is a witch.
Yeah.
So a lot of times in lore, if you look at different cultures, these creatures will be referred to as vampiric witches. So it's like an amalgamation of the two, which I always thought was interesting, but that's neither here nor there. But this is our classic vampire, the Strigoi.
Yeah.
Do you-
And just as a addendum, for
Yeah.
those fan of you out there who are fans of the old Witcher video games or book series, I don't know if they're in the TV show or not. The female vampire creature is a Striga
Yeah.
in that, but it's all Slavic mythology too. So
Same. Albania has a Striga that is like a vampiric witch. It's that same
yeah,
thing. I always thought that was interesting. They kind of, in a lot of cultures, get thrown in the same pot.
right.
Vampire, witch, whatever it is, we
You
got to get rid of you.
right. You're not natural.
You're not natural. So what I think is so interesting about the Strigoi and Romanian vampiric culture in general is when you really start to dig down, is all of the ways that you could be made a vampire. It's a laundry list. Like if you're a twin who was born on the second Tuesday of like it is, there's a lot of stuff out there. So again, it's interesting over time how it's almost
Yeah.
like the gossip mill, it's the rumor mill. Like
Yeah.
over time, as these stories keep getting told and whispered about and retold, it's like the game of telephone to where you're like, well, I heard if you're a redhead who looked cross-eyed at a full moon, now you're a vampire. It's the wildest stuff out there. But
Yeah.
I'm more excited, like you said, about the ability to shape shift, the way that they can evade detection for such a long time. They're very smart creatures. They have magical abilities. Like that is the classic vampire that we're used to. The pale skin, can
Mhm.
fly, goes after the blood of the living, that kind of stuff. And like you said, starts with the family. And then once the family's wiped out, goes to friends and then continues to grow outside of its social circle until it's just wiping out villages.
Right. Which
Often,
happens to follow the disease model too.
yes, it does.
Yes.
And we'll talk about that when we talk about the vampire panic in New England not
Yeah,
too long
yeah.
ago,
That's a
which
nice one.
was tuberculosis.
It was in the first issue of Anthropology magazine.
Yes.
Like that's
So,
crazy. But
spoiler
anyway,
alert,
yeah.
it was TB. But
Yeah, the consumption, in case you don't
Mhm.
know.
But like what's so interesting in Romania is, and it will happen as it gets over here to the United States, is the way that the vampires were blamed for everything. If your crop died, vampires. If your best cow got sick, vampires. If you lost all your money, vampires. It's right in there with the witches. The witches did it to
Yeah.
me. Garlic. And you know what I always thought was so interesting is, do you know that garlic is a natural antibacteria?
Right.
Yeah. So if
Yeah.
you go back to that idea of, well, and also for a really long time, garlic was considered like a blessing from God. And so garlic was like something that was given to us by God to bless us. But that I get that going back to the idea that vampirism is viral or a bacteria, it's interesting how now you have that garlic will help you idea. Holy items, big one. The
Of course.
big one, big one. And then the stake to the heart, as we talked about, was really to pin them down so they couldn't get
Mhm.
back out. My favorite thing about the Romanian vampire legend is the one about putting the person who's pure of heart, whether it be a young boy or a virgin girl, on the
Yeah.
white horse and walking the horse through the graveyard. And
Yeah.
we see that in Subspecies, which a lot of people don't know that movie, but that's
Well, it's in the 79 Dracula too.
yes. Yes.
It's in the
yes.
background. The white
With
horse is in the
Langella.
graveyard.
Yeah.
Trying to find yeah.
Mhm.
So it shows up again, but that's
Mhm.
definitely part of this. What I think what people should maybe I want to make it clear that up until now, we've not talked about holy objects or garlic, but the Romanian vampire, we get holy objects, garlic, and staking, which
Yes.
all work their way into modern vampires because of several reasons. Emily Gerard, who was the wife of I think she was the ambassador or something, to Romania, wrote a book called Through the Woods. I think it was called Through the Woods, about Transylvania. And she writes down these legends like, this is how you deal with, she calls it the Nosferatu. And one of the things she says, in addition to all this, is that you shoot a bullet into the grave, which I don't know what that's about. Yeah, it's just random.
That's interesting.
But Gerard also, and other sources have talked about this too, puts forth this idea of something called a living vampire. sometimes called a good vampire. And these
Yes.
are going back to what you're saying about weird ways to become vampires. If are the illegitimate offspring of two illegitimate people,
Yes.
so you're born out of wedlock from parents who were born out of wedlock, then you definitely are going to become a vampire. However, there's also a tradition that if people think your dad, let's say it's usually with men, if people think your dad's a vampire, then you too will become a vampire. But your redemption is you can save the village from your dad.
Yes.
And if you live a good life and, repent of your sins, you won't become a vampire. But if you are a bad guy, then you will become a vampire.
Yeah, there is one. Oh man, I'm going to beat myself up for not remembering which one it is. But one of those Slavic regions, if you were a Dhampir, the son of a vampire, so
Yeah.
half vampire, half human, like a daywalker, like Blade, then you are a natural born vampire killer. So you're
Right.
the only person who can see the vampire, capture the vampire. And so they would travel and like sell their skills around.
Yeah.
But, like, I am the son of a vampire. Only I can catch him. And the thing was, you had to catch him in a glass bottle and throw him in a fire. And it was probably a very interesting show, whatever this
I
person
bet.
was doing. But I always
Yeah.
thought that was a real interesting one too, is like,
Yeah.
how do you prove you just had to believe him, right?
Well, right, especially if things are going crazy in your town. I mean, maybe we got to get the vampire guy, vampire
So
killer.
interesting. I just imagine a guy with like a business card and he's like, hey, do you happen to have a lot of plagues? It's a vampire.
You
But
know, I'm
guess
surprised there's not some Hollywood B movie about this, or
what?
A movie even.
Wait. Let's edit this out and let's write it. Not giving
Okay.
me I just thought that was so good. What a great. I mean, you got to do what you got to do to make money, but like, what a great shtick to have going
Yeah.
for you.
It's totally based on a real belief, a real folk
Mhm.
belief that these people they had those powers.
Yes. There is a movie. It just came out on Netflix with I feel so bad that I'm forgetting his name. But he played the governor in The Walking Dead, and I just watched it. I reviewed it last year, and the premise of the movie is that he is going from village to village to village saying, I am a
Oh.
Dhampir, and then of course encounters actual vampires.
Right,
And now
right,
he like
right.
actually has to fight. So that was a real good, that is
Oh, how
kind of
about that?
along that line.
So someone did make that movie.
Someone did make that movie. And what's funny is I reviewed it and I completely forgot about it there for a minute. But that's how it starts. And I remember watching it thinking, I thought I was the only one that knew this like very weird idea that was out there. That, and like you said, normally it's a male vampire with a female human who happens to conceive a baby, and the baby is a Dhampir. But
So
sorry.
he's like an incubus in a way.
Yeah.
Dad, I guess.
Yeah.
Which I have to say, just as an aside, the band Incubus is way too tame for the name they have. Like, I'm expecting death metal or something, and it's like not. It's like power pop.
That's so funny. Mark, what a hot take from you.
Yep, that's my hot take. From
that's my hot
straight
take.
from the late 90s.
That is such a hardcore name. And for you to take that on
right
and not do
and
it
suck.
justice is very disappointing to me. Hot take.
Right.
Anywho, did we touch on all the stuff you wanted to talk about Romania and Strigoi?
I think so. Yeah, we're good. We're
Are
good
you sure
there.
you sound sad?
Yeah.
You
Well,
sound resigned.
it's time to move on.
It is time to move to the big guy.
Vampires have now entered literature, and there's
the big boy.
Yep.
The name of the movie is Dhampir. How did I forget that? Anywho, oh, what a shame. All right, so let's talk about the big boy, Mr. Vlad Tepes. I did an entire episode last spooky season on just him, and then I did one on just Elizabeth Bathory, because as you dig down and really do the research, what an interesting character in history. So the fact that somebody latched onto him and ran with it, you can't even be surprised. You see, I have my Vlad Tepes shirt here.
Oh, that's Vlad's woodcutting.
Yeah, the famous woodcutting. So
from the German book.
I know. In a nutshell, anyone who wants the full down and dirty about him can go listen to the full episode. And I don't need to teach you about him, but in a
No,
nutshell, it's 1431, kind of like a rough time to be a tiny village. And he is born to Vlad II, who's in the Order of the Dragon, which is where we get Dracul, and then Dracula is son of the dragon. And so his dad is in charge of Wallachia. And I've heard two stories. So the first one was that Vlad II, because as of right now, the Ottoman Empire is massive, and the Ottoman Empire wants all of you. They want it all. They're going to take it all in the name of Islam.
The Order of the Dragon is formed by the Holy
church.
Roman Emperor to fight against, and it's a conglomerate, not just of Catholics, it's Catholics and Orthodox together who are trying to keep the Muslim Turks out of Europe. That's their job. Yeah.
Right. Because the enemy of your enemy is your friend. So you're just like, all right, we're going to come together. We're going to make the Order of the Dragon. And they get a whole bunch of men in power in the area, bring them into the Order of the Dragon. And they're like, all of us together, we're going to stop the Turks. So Vlad II goes to the Sultan to try and just work like gentleman to gentleman to try and work out some kind of treaty. And I've heard two stories. One is that the Sultan traps them and allows Vlad II to leave, but he has to leave his two sons, which are Vlad and Radu. The other story is that Vlad II said, you can have my boys as a gift, which I hope that's not true, but given
there's a third story.
Oh, what's the third story?
Third story that I'm aware of is that the Turks, even though they didn't quite run Wallachia there, they demanded tribute. And so one of the things the Turks were famous for was the Janissary Corps. And the Janissaries were, you would send your boys to the Turks and they would be raised as Turkish men. They were too young to remember where they came from. Then they would be sent back to their home village to fight. And people might recognize their kids now, but the kids would have no idea. And so anyway, that idea is out there, and that Vlad II refuses to pay the tribute, and the Sultan demands his kids instead.
Yeah.
But I gotta say, it sounds to me from everything I've read, it seems to me from everything I read that Vlad and Radu were highly educated. I mean, they're in Constantinople. They're highly educated. They're given a really good life. They're taught the art of war, which Vlad turns against them.
Yes.
Radu buys it all the way.
Yeah,
Radu's
he's totally on the
always,
Turkish side.
Yeah.
Yes.
And when Vlad gets out, when he's released, then he's like, well, I'm going to get those guys.
Right. I'm going to go take my father's seat. And then we have the brother versus brother story, which is a classic story. I mean,
and there's another. So Vlad ends up, Vlad the dad Vlad too. He has another wife, and he has another kid named Vlad. He keeps naming all his kids Vlad, and that Vlad and the mom, when Vlad III comes back, he puts them away in monasteries. So she becomes a nun, and he becomes I can't remember. The monk is the name he's given, though.
Right. But they got off easy, if that's true.
Oh, no.
Because he got them out of the, Yeah. So
anyway.
I didn't know he had a half-brother named Vlad.
Yeah.
So good. It's like George Foreman naming all his kids.
Yeah, Kid George. Yeah.
Oh, my gosh. Anywho. So Vlad III ends up, after fighting a bunch of the nobles in the area, gets to take over is it Voivode?
Voivode, yeah.
Voivode. Yeah. So he's in charge of Wallachia now. And so his way of leading, some might say, is a little barbaric. It's a little cruel.
One might call it medieval.
One might call it medieval. He's a bit of a character. And so the stories are, I mean, anybody who hears even a fourth of what he did is true. That is something to write home about. It's something you're going to see in your nightmares. So obviously the one he's the most famous for the story is that he was found eating dinner in a field surrounded by thousands of impaled human beings, slowly sliding down, screaming, dying, and he was just eating dinner. So that's the most famous story.
And there is an old wood cut print of that where he's
From the
sitting at the
German book
table.
that
Yeah.
everybody has seen.
So, but just to kind of to give Vlad, you know, some to speak for Vlad, the Germans who were in the area of Wallachia there, they were all part of the merchant guild and they weren't paying their taxes. So Vlad said, "You owe us taxes," and they wouldn't pay it. So he started impaling them.
Yes.
And you know what they did? They
Paid their
paid
taxes. Right.
And so, but then it also gave rise to a lot of stories about how evil Vlad was.
Oh, yeah.
But it's all filtered through the Germans who had to pay their taxes.
Of course.
Just saying. Now, the Forest the Impaled is an interesting thing too, because there's a secondary aspect to that where whenever Turkish soldiers or spies would come, they would capture them and kill them and keep them in the mountains to stay cold. So the Forest of the Impaled was people who had been dead for something like 5 years. And when the Turks came to invade and found this, and they realized like that guy's been dead for 5 years. He's been saving them. And they were impaled according to their status. So the higher status they were, the bigger pole they had. The Turks turned around and went home. They didn't fight.
I bet.
Like, we're not going to do this.
I know. I bet. So it's interesting because if you talk to different people, they have different ideas. And some of them say like he did what he had to do to very quickly get control of his territory because there was a lot of crime. There was a lot of issues there.
Yeah.
So to very quickly get control of his territory and protect it from the people who were coming from the outside to try and take it over, he did what he had to do. Right. So that's right. And we all know how this works. If he had 10 people impaled, by the time that story is told across the sea, it's 10,000 and they're all screaming and there's babies and stuff like that.
I'm pretty sure it's like 250,000 or something is like the number.
Of course. Why not? And I read another story that said a man refused to take his hat off.
Yeah.
And so, his turban, refused to take his turban off. So Vlad nailed it to his head. Like the stories. Yes. I mean, you could talk all day about the stories about him.
That story ends up becoming a legend attached to Ivan the Terrible in Russia. But it's actually from Vlad. Yeah.
Yes.
It's interesting. It gets around.
Yeah. Oh, so many stories. So many stories. So then of course he dies in battle, right? Like a man's man, he dies in battle.
Right. He might have been accidentally killed by one of his own men.
Right. Somebody's like, oops. And he is put into many pieces, and I think the head was sent to the Turkish ruler at that point in time.
That's the story.
There are many stories that he wrote that his grave was empty and he's never died and blah 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 blah. So
he was buried in a monastery, Snagov Monastery, which is on an island, a Romanian monastery, an island that I think he built, he funded. And they dug up his bones like 20, 30 years ago, and it was an animal. It wasn't a person. So
dun dun dun.
Yep, right.
Yeah,
I mean, I don't know about his head.
So the thing is like, if you're the family, we have to bury him somewhere where nobody knows where he is. So I would think they put him somewhere unmarked, or only 5 people knew where he was, and then the one that was marked was an animal or something, because people, not a well-loved guy, the Vlad the Third. So
I'm not sure about that. I think history, this is one of those places where history isn't sure what to do about it, because he's captured by his cousin, sort of, Stephen of Hungary, and forced to marry his sister and become Catholic. And like Vlad does all that stuff, and he gives so much of his wealth away to building churches and monasteries and all this other stuff. He's not, I mean, if you think of it from the point of view of a ruler of that time, he's probably, there's a reason why he's considered like a hero of Romania.
Yes.
Because he was, from that perspective.
Yes.
Now, from our perspective now, he looks like a complete madman. But, how many Irish and Scottish people did the English kings put to
I know. Right, right.
So, but
So,
yeah,
and that's the thing, right? Because I truly believe that 99% of people wake up in the morning and say, I want to do a good job today. I want to, like, I don't think people wake up and say, I want to be remembered as evil. So putting in the idea that he was a human man ruling in a difficult time, you can see where he would make the choices he made. And again, we
Yeah.
don't know what really happened because
Right.
we just have the stories. That's all we have. That
Yeah.
being said, how could you not take that character and turn it into something? I mean, it was ripe for the picking.
Yeah.
So you hear that story, much like Elizabeth Bathory, who I did a complete episode on. The stories are oh, just before we leave Vlad, one of the stories in the many stories is that one of the things he loved to do at dinner was dip his bread into bowls of blood. So I think that's where the blood drinker thing came from.
Perhaps. But,
Perhaps.
well, I mean, I recommended to you the book In Search of Dracula by
Yeah.
Radu Florescu and whatever his
Yeah.
name is,
Mhm.
McNally. And that book was written in the 80s, I want to say.
Mhm.
And one of the claims they make in the book is that they are actually figuring out that Dracula who Dracula is. Like Dracula was kind of lost to Western memory to a certain degree. And Bram Stoker took a little bit of information that he had to build the
Yes.
character.
Yes.
Whereas what we know about Vlad now is because these guys did all this research
Right.
and wrote this book basically.
Mhm.
So I don't want to give Vlad too much credit here because Stoker made up a lot. He didn't have a lot to go with
Right.
on Vlad. But he definitely made a colorful character and did draw on him a little bit because
Sure.
Dracula does talk about how great he was, this great warrior and all this other stuff.
Mhm.
So
Totally. And we can also see a little bit of inspiration from different things as well.
yeah,
Like any good author, you take a piece from this and a piece from this and a piece from this. And I think that Vlad was a good physical representation of a vampire.
yeah,
Born in the
yeah,
right area and born into the right time. And I am reading that book, which I find so interesting because it was written right around, I want to say, the end of the reign of Nicolae Ceausescu,
yeah.
dictator
Mhm.
who the people finally like rallied against and got rid of. But one of his
Yeah,
big things was Vlad Tepes is a hero, and he put out a
yeah,
postage stamp, and it was like a whole
mhm,
thing. And he
yeah,
famously would not allow Werner Herzog to film Nosferatu the Vampire in Romania because they were going to portray Dracula as a bad person, and Nicolae would not allow that. So very, very polarizing figure, as many great historical figures are. But much like
mm,
Elizabeth Bathory, when you start looking into what was happening at the time, the stories and the reality, everything I thought I knew about her was entirely inaccurate. Obviously, I was told that she tortured hundreds of virgin girls and bathed in their blood and this and that. Well, then you come to find out that she was widowed, had a great deal of money and land, and I think it was one of the kings owed her family money. And so he gets her own cousin to investigate her,
yeah,
finds her guilty, and says, I'll tell you what, if you just forgive everything I owe your family, then I'll just allow house arrest instead of you going to prison. So
right,
she's famously locked up because the idea of a woman having that much money and that much property just was unacceptable.
right. And they signed it. They made sure it was all signed over to her son first.
Yes,
There was a whole thing there. However, there are still a lot of
a
crazy
lot of
stories.
abuse, a lot of abuse. Yeah.
She opened up that Gykeneum school to a finishing school for young women, and
Mhm.
it really feeds into the myth that it was really just a way to get blood.
I
So I
know,
don't
it's
know.
good. It's
Yeah,
good. I mean, do I
uh,
think she was a great person? Probably not. But
I
do
have
I
no
think
idea.
she bathed
Uh,
in the blood of thousands of virgins? Less likely.
Maybe it's just
Not
hundreds.
impossible. I've seen some crazy things, but
Yeah,
it's just interesting when you start to break down the time period and the history and the politics and the
yeah,
red tape. You're
right.
like, huh, perhaps.
As an academic, when I was looking into Elizabeth Bathory, I had to laugh a little bit because the scholarship from like the 90s is all like kind of feminist, and it's like she was a powerful woman who is being vilified.
Mhm.
And then the scholarship earlier than the 90s is that she was like a crazy woman who was killing people, right?
Murderous. Yes.
More modern scholarship is somewhere in the middle. It's like, you know what? She was vilified as a woman in power, but she was also up to some shady things.
Oh, for sure.
And we're not sure exactly how much she may have been killing people, because
Sure.
there was a trail of bodies in her wake.
Oh, yeah.
And you know where the truth is, we'll never.
Somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
Yeah, somewhere in the middle. Even to this day, if we could bring her back and ask her side of the story, probably not going to tell the truth. So it is what it is. All right, we're going to move on because this is where we get to slide from Vlad Tepes into now it's in paper. Now we've written about vampires before this point, but now
Poems, mostly poems.
now it's starting to become like a hot topic. So
Yeah.
I did not know this about Polidori. You taught me something I did not know. So
It's the greatest story ever told.
if
Well,
you have learned anything, you and I are both at the doctorate level. The one thing I have learned from all of my education is that I know so little.
Yep. That's what you learn. The
I
more
know
educated you get.
nothing.
Right. That's
One
why
of the
people.
things. Go ahead.
Nothing. I'm gonna keep my mouth shut.
Oh,
But
okay.
yeah, this is a good.
The more I learn, the more I study, the more I learn that I need to learn and I need to study. And one of the things I have drilled into my daughters and my nursing students is, what is the source?
Mm-hmm.
What is the source? So if you come to me with information, what is the source? So I never assume that I know everything, nor do I assume that what I know is accurate. I'm always open to somebody telling me something different. And that's why I was so excited to meet you, because I was like, here's somebody else at the academic level I'm at that has that same level of research ability and knowledge. And so you taught me something about Polidori's story. So the story I heard was that there was a competition between Percy Shelley, Lord Byron, Mary Shelley, and John Polidori of who could tell the spookiest story. Like, what you have X amount of hours,
right,
to write a story. We're all going to come back and it's going to be a competition, which I think is a very fun weekend, right? It might just be me, but I would be so here for that. And that they came back, Mary Shelley came back with Frankenstein, and John Polidori came back with the vampire. And you taught me otherwise. So go ahead.
Yeah, I love this story. So before the story writing contest, which was held in a little chateau on Lake Geneva. So Polidori is a doctor, and he is Byron's personal physician, because Byron is the most interesting man in the world at this point in time, right? Byron is the coolest dude ever. And he gets invited to spend some time with his friend, Percy Shelley, and his family in Geneva. And he says to Polidori, "You want to go?" And Polidori's like, "Yeah, I'll go." In the meantime, interestingly enough, the Shelleys and Mary Shelley's half-sister or stepsister, Claire Claremont, they walked to Switzerland from England. I mean, they took a boat and then they walked.
Wow.
Right? Why not?
Okay.
And Mary Shelley had basically left her family as a teenager, and Percy left his wife and children, who committed suicide, by the way, after he left them. Totally romantic period.
Oh boy.
So, and Claire Claremont was apparently quite beautiful, and Byron had a thing for her, but in kind of a Byron way, like it's more like a hookup than a relationship. And so that's the background. It's raining, they can't enjoy the lake at all, so they do the scary story competition. And actually, Byron writes a story about vampires. Polidori didn't write anything.
Okay.
Byron wrote the story about vampires and we actually have a fragment of it left. Shelley writes Frankenstein, or the outline of what becomes the new Prometheus, Frankenstein. And so somewhere in this time, Polidori and Byron have a falling out because Byron is a jerk. I can imagine what, just think of like a rock star who thinks they're the greatest, right? That's Byron, right? He was such a jerk that he got Claremont pregnant. She had a baby. He took the baby, renamed the baby, and put the baby in a monastery and never told her and wouldn't let her see her. And then the kid died as like a 3-year-old or something because he didn't want to deal with it. He was like, I want the baby. And then he's like, I got to be Byron. What am I going to do with this baby? And got rid of her and changed the name so the mom wouldn't find her. So Byron's kind of a jerk. Anyway, Polidori really doesn't like Byron now. And so he decides to rip off Byron's vampire idea and write a story. And he does. And he calls it The Vampire, and it gets published. His name's not on it. And people believe it's by Byron, and it sells like hotcakes, right? And only then does it come out that it wasn't. So through my own curiosity, I started poking around and found out that the name of the bad guy in Polidori's story is Lord Ruthven, who's our first aristocrat vampire. Yeah, usually they're peasants. He's now a lord. And Polidori tells us that we don't know what his rank actually is. He's a lord. But the name Ruthven actually comes from a character in a novel by a woman named Caroline Lamb. And she wrote this novel called Glenavron about this guy named Ruthven, who was a womanizer who took advantage of women. And she was one of Byron's jilted lovers. And Ruthven was her code name for Byron.
Nice.
So when Polidori writes his story and he's pissed off at Byron, he borrows Ruthven because everyone knows who Ruthven is. It's Byron. And he makes his vampire into, in a way, a really awful guy. Like the guy relishes in, if I'm poor and I come to Lord Ruthven and say, please, I lost my job, I want to feed my family, he's going to say no. But if I come and I say, I need to feed my family, so I want to try and earn more money at the craps table, he's going to say, oh yeah, sounds like a plan, and let you get even more ruined. Like he's a real vampire and that he destroys everything he touches. And but think of it in terms of, this is a metaphor for Byron. This is how people saw Byron. Like,
and so now knowing that story, this all makes so much more sense. It puts the story in a new light. And it's not a hard read. It's less than 90 pages. Yeah, it's very short. But it is that, like, the aristocrat comes, takes this young man under his wing. They travel. At first, it seems kind of good. But then the young man starts to see signs that maybe Ruthven is not the best person.
Yeah, he's like corrupting young girls. The better, like the more of a good person you are, the more Ruthven wants to try to destroy you.
Yeah, and not just young girls, but like a daughter of a friend. Like
yeah.
So
their
bad
moms,
stuff. Yeah, bad stuff. And they're attacked, and a dagger's left behind, and because they have a falling out. He says to Ruthven, like, I don't want to be around you anymore. They split up.
Right. They're in Italy, and the young man's name is Aubrey. He says to Ruthven, like, I can't be a part of this anymore. He goes to Greece and just hangs out looking at ruins. Falls in love with a
girl.
She tells him the story about how vampires live in the hills, and they have to drink the blood of a young virgin every year to remain alive, which is a new twist.
It's not that bad. Once a year.
Yeah, that's it. But you got to kill the girl.
Well, I mean, the vampires we know have to do that often.
Right. Yeah.
So once a year, not too bad. Easier to hide the bodies too, because it's just once a year. But we're getting sidetracked. Yes. So they're attacked. The girl is killed. A dagger is left behind. Aubrey's left for dead.
Well, okay. I'm gonna
go ahead.
Give a slight correction there.
Okay.
So Aubrey goes off to the ruins and the girl Ianthe tells him, you shouldn't go to the ruins today because it is exactly like the day that the vampires are out.
Oh, right.
And he's like, whatever.
It's like written on the calendar, Vampire Day.
And Yeah, and she's like, if you do, you must be home before sundown. That's the rule.
Yes.
And he's
Yes.
like, okay. But he's having such a great time at the ruins that he loses track of time. He's coming home as it's dusk. It starts raining. He finds a shack to try to get some relief from the rain. I think his horse died too. And he hears a girl screaming, and he
Mhm.
goes in and finds a girl being attacked. He attacks the guy, who throws him across the room and is
Mhm.
about to kill him when other guys show up with torches, and then the killer flees.
Mhm.
And so all that's left is the knife and the dead girl, who happens to be Ianthe,
The girl
who
that
was
he
going
loved.
to get him,
Yeah.
Aubrey, to save herself. Right.
Such a
That's
good trope.
yeah.
Such a good trope. I love it.
Yeah.
Such a romantic setup. So he's injured and
Yeah.
not doing so hot. Very unshockingly to any of us, Ruthven comes back.
Right. He comes
Yeah.
to help him
He's
nurse
like,
him back to
I
health.
know we got in this big fight and you think I'm a bad person, but I'm actually going to nurse you back to
Right.
health.
And he does.
Now Aubrey's like, I owe this guy, and maybe he's not that bad.
Mhm.
But this is when they're attacked, right on the road.
Now they're attacked by
Now
the
they're attacked.
bandits.
It's all
Banditi,
coming back
as
to me.
Caldori says. Yeah. They're attacked
Ruthven
by
is
the bandits. Ruthven's shot.
yes, and he's obviously gonna die, and he
Yeah.
says, "You can't tell anybody about me for a year and a day."
Right.
Weird, very specific, but okay.
Right. Then Aubrey goes for a little walk to like clear his mind because his
Goes
best
on a
friend just
walkabout.
died.
Yeah.
And when he comes back, Ruthven's body's missing. And he says to them, where because there's guys there. Actually, no, it's the bandits. If I recall, they convinced the bandits to now help them.
Yeah.
So I think they paid them. And then the bandits say, well, he said he needed to be put in the first rays of the moonlight or something.
Mhm.
So when they go to find his body, it's gone.
Totally.
And
Not weird at
that's the
all.
end. No.
Not
That's the
weird
end
at
of
all.
Ruthven. Well,
Yes.
Aubrey said in the book, it says Aubrey speculates that they buried his body and stole his clothes. Like they probably wanted to steal his stuff.
Right. Right.
So he goes back to England.
So he goes back to England. But unfortunately, guess who's in England?
Well, before he gets to England, he's going through Ruthven's stuff
Oh,
because he's in
this
charge
is
of his estate. And he
this is when he
finds
finds the dagger sheath.
right, that's empty, but has all the same decorations
Markings.
as the
which is
dagger.
so weird.
Yeah. So now he's like, oh no.
Yeah. So he's like, I just made an oath to the guy that killed the girl I love.
Yeah.
But he is a good man, and he will keep to his oath
Yeah.
because he's a man of his word.
Yeah.
So they go back, and Ruthven is there. He's
Well,
alive.
sort of at first. So he moves in with his sister, and her sister's like, I don't know, caretakers, wards or whatever, warders.
Mhm.
And she comes of age. The way the book describes it's really creepy. It's like he was surprised to see how in blossom she was or
Oh
something.
yes.
I'm like, yeah, I'm a little incestual there.
Yeah.
And she has her coming out party, and she meets this Earl of Marsden and falls for him, and then tells Aubrey, "I'm going to marry the Earl of Marsden." He's like, "That's great." He's going to meet the Earl of Marsden,
Mm.
and who is the Earl of
Yes.
Marsden?
Yeah. Dun dun dun. But
And
he
he-
can't say anything to his
Right.
sister.
In fact, Ruthven says, "Remember your oath," like 10 times. Remember your oath.
Yeah.
Remember your oath.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
his oath is more important than his sister's life.
And his sister, who we're assuming is like 16, if we're
Yep.
lucky.
Yes.
So it's like the day that his oath is going to expire, and he's watching the clock.
Yep.
But they are married. He's finally ready to tell, but it's too late.
Right. So he tells the warders he tells them the story. They rush off to try to find her because she married Ruthven that day, and they've sailed over to France or something. So the warders go to find her, and they do find her, and she's dead and drained of blood, and Ruthven's nowhere to be found.
Right.
And
And that was because the timing. So a year and a day,
Yeah.
because he would have to feed again. And so
right. Exactly.
somehow Ruthven knew all of this was going to happen,
Yeah.
which, okay.
Well, so it's his ultimate ruin of Aubrey, right? So he sees Aubrey descend into madness. He brings him back from that, and then he sets him up ultimately for the ultimate
Mhm.
madness, right? The whole thing
Mhm.
is Aubrey's sanity. Aubrey's a good guy, and Ruthven completely destroys him to the point where Aubrey dies just of, in Victorian England, one can die
A
of
heartbreak.
yeah, or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. So what's interesting is now that you've told me what led up to this story and how Ruthven is supposed to be Byron, it makes you wonder what secrets did Polidori have to keep for Byron as his physician that he probably is not allowed to repeat, but now he knows.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, we know the story of Claire Claremont and her child, right? But how many other stories do we not know about,
I
right?
couldn't even imagine.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. I'll have to go back and reread the whole thing knowing what I know now.
Yeah, definitely. It puts it in a nice perspective, especially knowing that Ruthven is based on this womanizing, and specifically, he tends to be really cruel towards young women.
Correct.
Yeah.
Which makes you
And
wonder.
that's this kind of evil. But
Oh,
you know, they
boy.
made a play version of it.
Well, you saw that, you put that in the notes. So tell everybody
Yeah.
about that.
So that story came out, I believe, in 1819. 1820, a French theater company put on a version of the play. And then later on in that year, a British company bought the rights, and they asked this guy, Planchet, to write to make it for the British audience. And the money people were telling him, like, it has to be set in Scotland. And he's like, there's no vampires in Scotland. In fact, if you ever read the play, there is a author's preface that says, like, basically, I'm going to paraphrase, but they told me it has to be set in Scotland, but that's stupid because we all know there's no vampires in Scotland. But here's the play that I had to write. He didn't quite say that, but it's subtext. So in this version of the play, though, the Earl of it's almost as if it's like Aubrey's dad, who doesn't exist in the original play. The dad has a daughter, Margaret, and he's going to marry her to the Earl of Marsden, who is the brother of Ruthven, who is the dad's, like, friend or something. It's convoluted. And anyway, Ruthven's a vampire, and he has to try to get her before midnight, and eventually he's about to marry her in the middle of the night, and the dad breaks the oath and saves the girl, and then Ruthven is struck by lightning, and that's it, he's gone. But it's interesting because they switch it in the story. Everybody dies and Ruthven escapes, but in the play, Ruthven dies and everybody escapes.
Yeah.
So
which is a trope we're used to. The bad guy doesn't win.
Yeah. No.
But
And
there's a
nice.
tie to the Lyceum, which we know has a tie to Dracula.
Stoker, right? Because they put it on at the Lyceum Theater. I mean, this is 80 years before Bram Stoker worked there, but still, I mean, it's still the same theater. Yeah, I just found that out yesterday.
Interesting. That's so interesting. And explain the vampire door.
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, stages have always had certain trapdoors in them, but they created a special door so that the vampire could, like, rise up out of the grave kind of thing and then disappear back into it. And it was dubbed the vampire door. And now that's what it's called. Like, if you visit stages, that stage is called the vampire door, but it's because it was created for this play.
That's so fun. Cool. Yeah. I love that, because who doesn't love the vampire rising from the grave scene?
Yeah.
And then we get into Varney the Vampire, which I'm surprised how many people have never heard of. So a lot of times, not only do I have to explain Varney the Vampire, but I have to explain what penny dreadfuls are. So people are familiar with the phrase penny dreadful, but they are not familiar with that concept, that idea of, like, this thing comes out once a week and you run out and buy it, and it's a continuation of the story. And I remember growing up in the 80s and 90s, King did it with the Green Mile, where it came out in little tiny vignettes, and other people have done it that way, where it came out in tiny vignettes. But penny dreadfuls were sort of like, it was trash. They were trash mags. So
well, but almost all of Charles Dickens were penny dreadfuls. Well, they weren't penny dreadfuls; they were penny publications, and because you would get paid per issue, so it was in your best interest to drag the story on as long as you could.
And that's what I saw. You got paid per word, and I don't think I wrote it down, but the amount of words that they ended up churning out with Varney the Vampire was, like, ridiculous, and a ridiculous amount of words. But go ahead. No.
I just will say one of the other Penny Dreadfuls that was popular at the same time was called A String of Pearls. And String of Pearls happens to be about a certain dread barber of Fleet Street
Oh,
that people might
interesting.
know
That's
as
interesting.
Sweeney Todd.
My
So
daughters are
that's where that
currently
comes from.
obsessed with that show. They just discovered it, but
There is a Penny Dreadful origin to it.
interesting. So I can watching that show, you could see where it could come from. Penny Dreadfuls 100%. So I always knew that it had two writers, but you wrote that possibly not.
Pressed.
Yeah.
Pressed. They thought at first, people thought there was no name on it. People thought it was pressed at first.
Mhm.
By I don't know, the 1990s, scholars kind of switched and said they think it might be all James Malcolm Rymer.
Okay.
The truth is that nobody really knows.
Yeah.
But so Pressed and Rymer, or Pressed or Rymer, or just Rymer.
Yeah. Well, the most important thing is Barney the Vampire, very popular in Victorian England. And the first time we get to see vampires with fangs,
Right.
which
They
I
all, my
I,
students.
I hate vampires that don't have fangs. I'm just gonna
Come on.
I
I
I
say to
want
my students. So I'm sorry.
No,
I'm
go.
interrupting you because I'm
No,
getting
please.
excited. I say to my students at like the first day of class, I'll say to them, "Tell me what a vampire is," and it's like, can't go out in the sunlight, burns in the sunlight, wears a cloak, really old, has a widow's peak, has fangs,
Mhm.
is some kind of royalty or something. And I'm always like, nope, 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 nope. I mean, yes, but
Yes.
no.
Yeah. But I'm one of those people, and I'm so verbal about it, which is I love a classic vampire. So I know to everybody that's something different, but
It's
so
a
one of
revenant.
it's a revenant, yeah. So one of the interesting things about Barney the Vampire is it's the first time we see that sort of like brooding vampire
Yeah.
that doesn't like his existence, which is a trope that continues to this day.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
up until this point, we always had vampires reveling in what they were, you
Mhm.
know, sort of like using their abilities to do the worst of all things. But then we have this character that it doesn't like what he is. And
No.
it's a punishment. It was brought onto him as a punishment. It was a curse. So I thought that was very interesting because that is something that we still see to this day.
Mhm. And he tries to kill himself many, many times
He
in the
does.
stories.
Yeah.
It reminds me of like the Hulk in the Avengers movie where he's like, I tried to kill myself every single way. I put a bullet in my mouth and the Hulk caught it. Blah, blah. Varney's the same way. He cannot kill himself
Yes.
until he hits on jumping into Mount Vesuvius,
Which
works.
dramatic. But
I
yeah.
assume.
I mean, if that doesn't work, then and then we're gonna slide into 1872, which is Carmilla. Another one that I'm surprised a lot of people do not know.
I think Carmilla would have been the vampire story if it hadn't been eclipsed by Dracula.
Correct.
Carmilla is so good.
It is
so
good. It's so haunting. It has that like eeriness to it. There's an air of mystery around it. The idea of the way that she sort of like inserts herself into families, and also what's so good about her is that she is so innocuous. You don't, so like with Dracula, like he looks terrifying, but she just looks like a young woman who
right.
needs, you know, and that's
And
what's so
she's
scary
sickly
about it. Yes.
Right. She just like sleeps and drinks hot chocolate. Like literally
Yes.
that's what she does.
Yeah, yeah.
And kills women. But
Yes. So, you know, how easily she gets herself invited into these families and then, you know, gets rid of a daughter and disappears and only to move on and do it again. And she's got this person with her that kind of helps her do this, which we see in Let the Right One In. That idea of like this person who makes sure the vampire gets to the next stop. But Camilla is such a beautiful story and so well written. And like you said, I think unfortunately, not long after this, Dracula comes out and everyone forgets about Carmilla.
Right. And you know, that handler or whatever you want to call her that Carmilla has, it seems like she might be a vampire or supernatural too, because there's a whole section where when she's trying to convince General Spielsdorf to for her daughter to come stay with them, Bertha is Spielsdorf's niece. She knows everything about his past, but she only knows about his past when she touches his arm. So it says she touches his arm and then she tells him, "You remember we met at this place?" And he's like, "I don't remember that, but that did happen." So she has some kind of supernatural power. And then there's a third person. So there, when we meet Carmilla, she's in a carriage that flips over because the horses see a cross. There's a cross out of stone, and the horses scare at the cross, and the carriage trips over. Carmilla is hurt. There's her mom, and then there's a third woman, all in black, who is just there's nothing else about her. We don't know. It's all this mystery. We can have 20 sequels.
Yeah.
If anyone mind it.
So if you watch the Hammer film, The Vampire Lovers,
Yes.
it's Carmilla.
Yeah.
And it is the man in black in this one. And same thing.
Yeah.
We see him a couple times. He whispers to her handler the one time. He watches, he laughs, he disappears. And I love that. I love movies and books that don't hand you everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Did you, now you made a point to write out a quote. Did you want to read this quote?
Oh, sure. Let me give a little background on it first. So Carmilla spends all her days with this girl Laura, and we find out Laura and her dad live at this Austrian Schloss, like a chalet that was from her mother's family, but her mother's dead. So they find an old painting and they have it restored. And when they receive the painting, they can't believe it because the painting looks just like Carmilla. And I believe the name on it is like Princess Mircalla.
Mircalla.
Yeah. And now this Mircalla, though, is one of Laura's ancestors. It's in her mother's line. So then Laura has this dream when she's a kid that she's visited by this teenage girl. And when she meets Carmilla, she says, "Oh my gosh, you're the girl from my dream." And Carmilla says, "When I was a kid, I had a dream that a teenage you visited me." Carmilla is, if she invented gaslighting.
Yes.
Like 100%. She will say like, "No, that was you who visited me."
That's another hot take from this interview.
Yeah, no,
Carmilla,
completely.
She invented gaslighting.
Right. And so she slowly, like, so with all the other kills Carmilla has, the girls die in a matter of days. So Bertha dies in like 3 or 4 days. There's a young woman down the street who they attend her funeral. She dies in like 3 days. But Laura, she slowly gets sicker and weaker over time. She doesn't die. So there's at one point where Laura, I'll read this from chapter 4. Laura is writing about Carmilla. So Carmilla is like often very languid, like she's really lethargic and tired and almost, like, I don't know. She's always tired. So Laura says, "She used to place her pretty arms around my neck, draw me to her, and laying her cheek to mine, murmur with her lips near my ear, 'Dearest, your little heart is wounded. Think me not cruel because I obey the irresistible law of my strength and weakness.'" Basically, she likes her. "If your dear heart is wounded, my wild heart bleeds with yours. In the rapture of my enormous humiliation, I live in your warm life, and you shall die sweetly, die into mine. I cannot help it. As I draw near to you, you in your turn will draw near to others and learn the rapture of that cruelty, which yet is love. So for a while, seek to know no more of me and mine, but trust me with all of your loving spirit." And that was like an example of Carmilla's weird stuff. But Carmilla is essentially saying, "I am making you into a vampire so you can be with me and you will do the same things that I do." And sometimes I think there's a reading that Carmilla's trying to kill Laura, but I really honestly think this line and a few others point out that she's not trying to kill Laura, because Laura's actually her great granddaughter or something, right?
Right. That she's been visiting for years.
She's grooming her.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And the fact that she outright is telling her, "This is what I'm doing," is incredible to me. But I am surprised at how many people do not know this story.
I know. It's a shame. And the adaptations that have come out of it have been like Vampire Lovers is, I don't know. It's it's like whatever the letter under X is, right? It's like almost pornography.
I know.
And there's another there was like a web series called Carmilla, which had some potential, but it didn't work out very well. And there was a couple of movies that were made that are based on the premise of Carmilla, but none of
Mhm.
them have done it justice.
Yeah.
Ever.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting when I was looking into the Vampire Lovers that the rating was bumped up, not because of the girls kissing, which they fully show, but because of the bite marks on the breasts. That was too far. That was where they drew the line. They didn't like that. But yeah, it's a pretty close adaptation if you watch it. They call it the Vampire Lovers, but it's pretty close. So then just 25 years later, the big book comes out, which I read somewhere he sold it for 6 shillings.
Yeah, it's something like that. He really got shafted on that.
So
He
my
was on a
friends and I
very
have this like running joke that he was notoriously loved the bottle, and as a struggling writer, you're probably writing this thinking, well, nobody's going to read this. I don't care. I just want to make a little money off of it.
Yeah.
It's a silly book about vampires, and now you just never know. So it comes out, and the critics, not everybody hated it. There were critics that said, like, this is an incredible story. Victorian society, not so psyched about it.
Well.
And it wasn't
Mhm.
the gore, it wasn't the vampires so much as the aggressive female sexuality. They
Oh
did
yeah.
not like that these brides and then Lucy were sexually aggressive and went after what they wanted. I think they were worried that their women would get ideas. So they were like, no, no, no,
Uh-huh.
I don't
And
like that.
Lucy is when Lucy's alive, she's written like being this dark-haired, wonderful, gentle woman. And then when she's a vampire, she's blonde and voluptuous, right? She becomes a
Of
sex
course,
demon,
because
and
that's how that works.
yeah.
Uh-huh.
Right, exactly.
Uh-huh.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
so on the flip side, though, a lot of people were saying that this is sort of that like um warning of what happens when you give in to temptation, that the vampires
Sure.
are the representation of lust and all the things you're not supposed to give into. And
Right.
so when you as a Victorian person give in to this women, that then you will need the big strong men to come save you because now you've gotten yourself into trouble. So either way, it's massively popular. Massively popular.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people who now look back on it and obviously see a lot of anti-Slavic messaging. They talk about how they think that it came out of just like the fear at that time of plague and disease and the spreading of pestilence and things that you could not
Yeah.
stop and things that
And
were going to
for
wipe out the human race.
not just that, but the British Empire was at its height, right? The sun never sets on the British Empire.
Right.
And if you're a British citizen and you live in India, you have the right to go to England and London, but you don't look or sound or eat food or anything like the people in London do, right? You're
Yes.
not white, you're Asian or you're Indian or you're African
Yes.
or whatever. And that fear of England's going to be taken over by all the people that we've conquered. We've made them British, and now they're going to come and they're going to take Britain away from us.
Yes.
Where we heard that before.
I
Um,
know.
and so Dracula represents that because he is the foreigner who now comes and he doesn't just insinuate himself, but he converts people into his kind.
Yes.
Right? He makes
Buys
them.
multiple properties, takes
Yep,
their women, all the things that we don't want to happen to us.
exactly.
And so famously, they think that Abertoch was a little bit in there because he was raised in Ireland with that story, Vlad Tepes. Now, I always thought that he had visited Transylvania or Romania, but he never actually went over there.
He read the book Emily Gerard's Through the Forest.
Correct. So took the bits and pieces, and there's no shade. I'm an author. I took
No,
bits
that's how it works.
that I like. That's just how that works.
Research.
Right. And then Carmilla, of course, was fresh in everybody's mind.
Yeah.
But what is so interesting to me is that how, when you're writing this story, could you possibly have seen the way that it would impact society, horror, vampires? I mean, how many things can we trace back to this one book now? And what a wild
Yeah.
idea.
You know what's also kind of interesting about it is that the gothic novel had already peaked, right? I mean, you've got Frankenstein, Polidori's vampire, and a whole host of other supernatural gothic stories that all peak in the early to mid 1800s. And then we're in the Victorian era, and here we have Bram Stoker writing essentially a quintessential gothic horror film. It follows all the gothic horror rules, if you will.
Correct. Yes.
And it works. It works. It plays on lots of fears. I think when I know my students, when they read it, the thing they're most surprised about is the format. Because Dracula is written as a bunch of letters and journal entries and diary entries. It's not written as a novel.
Which you have to admit was very creative.
But I would say it's not all that creative, because if we go back to all the earlier vampire stories like Carmilla is Laura's diary.
That's true.
Right?
That's
There's
true.
always been this framing system in vampire stories where it's like, I'm going to tell you, or here are the documents I have. You decide for yourself if it's real or not. And that's what Dracula is. It's like, here's a collection of documents, and you piece it together and you form your own conclusions.
Which I love. And that's sort of the beginning of what we now have found footage.
Yeah.
The idea of like, oh, this was found lost in the woods somewhere. I'm just going to show you, it's not been edited. I'm just going to show you what I found, and then you decide what happened. But one of the things that you pointed out to me that I had never caught, and now it's all I can think about, is the lack of servants in Dracula's castle.
Oh, that's the best.
I never stopped to think that means Dracula cooked that dinner. The idea of him in the kitchen roasting a chicken.
It is on my test. And I'm saying, I'll tell anybody, here's a free, if you take my class, it's on the test. Dracula. So first of all, he picks up Jonathan Harker dressed as the coachman.
Yes,
and
that
then
I knew.
He stops the coach in the middle of the night to go digging for treasure, which is insane, right? What the hell you do that for? But he's digging for treasure. Then they get to the house and he says, wait here a second. And basically runs in the house, gets changed, answers the door as Dracula, leaves some of your happiness behind or whatever, brings him in and says, let's go upstairs. Oh, here's a roasted chicken, a bunch of vegetables, and this really old wine. Enjoy.
Which means he made that dinner.
He made the dinner.
Dracula
spent. Yeah, that's the best. That's the best part of the whole novel, right there.
I have read that book, and I just recently listened to it, like read out like an audio play almost.
Yeah.
And never thought about it. Never even thought about it. But that's one of the things I like about that book is, and we just saw it with The Last Voyage of the Demeter, is you can just take 3 pages out of the book and tell a whole new story.
Maybe we need to make a cooking movie
that is
about Dracula
like
roasting
him in the kitchen with like an apron on. And he's like,
got some old recipe book that he stole. There's a dead grandmother or something.
Long fingers trying
right.
to. I can never occurred to me.
Yeah, now you can't unsee it.
So then somebody said, well, what about the brides? And I said, they don't seem like they were going to be going into the kitchen making dinner.
They're not allowed in there. They have to stay in that one wing.
Right. So I'm just like, that means that Dracula made that dinner.
Yeah. And if you think about that whole episode at Castle Dracula, Harker is like, he starts saying, I'm convinced that Dracula is cleaning my room. Right. And he's like, I'm convinced. He looks out the window at one point and sees Dracula wearing his clothes.
Yeah.
And going to the post office, because I'm assuming nobody knows what Dracula looks like. And so someone wearing an English suit, they're going to assume it's the English guy who's here in town. Right. And they don't know who he is. Right. And because Dracula has Harker writing all these letters before he feeds them to the ladies.
Which is another part before he feeds them to the ladies.
Which he does.
So for this to work, That means that people from England have to be so concerned with their manners and being polite that they never push back on any of the weird stuff that's happening around them. And somebody's like, I need you to write all these letters saying that you're fine, everything's cool, nothing bad has happened to you, and that you're not going to be home for a couple weeks. And he's like, okay.
But he does push back a little bit, and he does find Dracula sleeping in the coffin, and he
Yes.
tries to cut his head off, but Dracula moves, and then
Yeah.
Parker freaks out. But another thing that's interesting about that whole thing is he just finds all the there's just piles of money everywhere, like because Dracula doesn't care. There's just
Yeah.
money everywhere.
Who's going to come rob Dracula?
Right.
Nobody.
It's great. It's
Like,
great.
I hope you rob me, because then the girls have dinner tonight.
Yeah, right. Well,
Please
then he
don't.
brings them dinner in the form of a baby.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
So crazy.
Right. And they fight over the baby. Then the mom comes looking for the baby, and
Mhm.
Dracula sicks the wolves on her, and they eat her.
know.
It's like there's these
Wild.
little things that are just, and Harker's like looking at this whole thing from a window. It's great. It's really
Wild. It's a wild
great.
story.
It
And
is.
it's one of those things that every time you read it, you're going to catch something else.
Yeah.
And then you look at it and you're like, has that always been in the book? Like, have I never caught this part of it? But all right. So Dracula,
Anyway.
Dracula is, we all know the name. Even people who know nothing about vampires know Dracula. Dracula is now a household name.
We thank you, Bela Lugosi. Really.
Thank you, Bella. And we're gonna, so that's where we're gonna, that's our next part, is Hollywood vampires.
Yeah.
So all of this superstition, all the lore, all the vampire hunts, everything we've talked about have all led up to these couple of stories we just mentioned. And then, of course, it hits the theater.
Yep.
So Dracula is now a stage play. And then famously, Stoker dies. I'm going to guess cirrhosis. Just throwing it out there.
Some people have speculated syphilis, because apparently his wife wasn't very interested in him, but the prostitutes were.
Either way.
Right.
Either way.
Do you know that Florence Balcombe Stoker had a rival? Bram Stoker had a rival, and it was none other than Oscar Wilde. But Oscar Wilde got imprisoned for buggery, for being gay.
Hmm?
And Stoker took advantage of it to marry Florence. But she never liked either of them.
Drama.
Isn't it great? And then, I mean,
but who are you if you're not married, right? Eventually you got to marry somebody.
Exactly.
So I love that you wrote in the notes, his wife Florence fell into genteel poverty, which is the middle class.
Yeah.
Just the middle
That's
class.
what I was reading like a biography or something, and it used the word genteel poverty, and I was like, so basically she had servants, but she didn't have like opera tickets.
All the she didn't have as many servants as some others. Yeah, I'm going to use that phrase from now on. So for people who don't know, you put in here the 1921, the Death of Dracula one, the Hungarian film, that she didn't even know was happening. But then Nosferatu happens.
Yeah,
so Nosferatu happens. And she's like, no. Because you've barely changed the story. I don't care what you named him. This is Dracula. So she fights it in court, and they are ordered to destroy all the copies. But one of the copies made it to America, where copyright laws don't mean a lick of anything. So now it is famously in the United States. So she says, well, fine. If you're going to have Nosferatu, then we're going to create a rival, which is why she sold the rights to Universal, which is how we have Bella's Dracula. Because she was like,
yeah, but there's a lot of years in there.
Between Nosferatu and Bela Lugosi's Dracula.
Yeah. And sorry.
No, go ahead.
So, what kind of happens is, after the Nosferatu thing, she realizes that there's money to be made. And so she gets a family friend, this guy, Hamilton Dean, to write a stage play of it. And he does. And it's the critics hate it, but it's like, the women were swooning, passing out in the aisles with fear. And then the Americans wanted to put it on, but they needed to Americanize it. So they hired this guy, Balderston, to do it. And it becomes the Balderston Dean. And Florence Stoker is upset because she's not getting the royalties that she thought she was going to get. So she hires a third guy named Charles Morel to write a new version, and she pays them outright. She's like, here's money for the play. I get all the rights.
Mm-hmm.
So the Balderston Dean version and the Morel version are kind of concurrent, and they're both doing pretty well. The Balderston Dean one's in Broadway, stars a Hungarian actor named Bela Lugosi.
Bela Lugosi, right.
And then Universal approaches Stoker and says, we'd like to do it. And she very astutely says, you can do it, but you have to buy the rights to all of the stage plays. So she gets the rights 3 times. She gets the royalties 3 times.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so the story I had heard is that she had decided once she realized it was over here, because it took some time for her to realize that a copy had survived and made it over here. Once she realized that, she said, well, if you're going to make money off of my story, then I'm going to make it the right way and then sort of drown you out. So
no, I mean, that might be part of it, but
yeah.
but the time period is like Nosferatu comes out in 1922, something like that, 21, 22, and then the first stage play is put on in 1927. So it takes those 5 years for the stage play to be finally performed, but also that's probably when she's realizing she can make money off of it.
Yeah.
And it's after the stage play goes through the 3 different iterations that Universal wants to put it on, wants to make a movie out of it. And they essentially do the Balderston play.
Right. And I heard, oh, wait, before we jump over, Nosferatu is the first time the vampire dies in sunlight.
He does. He like fades away at the end.
Yeah.
Goes,
so that's something important to note.
Yes.
Something important to note. The first time he dies in the sunlight.
Because in the novel, Dracula walks around in the sunlight.
Yeah, he's not as strong during the day, but he can be around in the sunlight. And they also do the thing where he's old and then he kind of starts to reverse backwards, which I always loved that trope. I thought that was
that's
great.
Yeah,
I thought that was great. So I had heard that when Universal was sort of like saying, maybe we should turn this into a movie, there was some pushback from the people who had the money in the studio who said, I don't know if horror pictures are really what we want to do. And that Bela was not their first choice for Dracula because they were worried people wouldn't be able to understand him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Dracula's not the first of the Universal monster films, though.
Yeah.
So they were making horror films. So they were already making horror films.
Maybe but I don't think they were doing so great.
I mean, after Dracula, boom, they make Frankenstein.
Dracula.
They make Bride of Frankenstein, Bride of Dracula. Abbott and Costello meet Bride of Dracula.
So everything I've read says that they were real hesitant about this full-length Dracula picture, that they didn't know if they wanted to sink money into this, and they were really reticent to hire Bela. So obviously they did, because we have Bela's Dracula and will forever have Bela's Dracula. And then this poor guy gets typecasted, and that's the rest of his career. And so then he had his own issues, as I can imagine. But the Bela Dracula, I mean, kicked off, like you said, Frankenstein, the Mummy, the Wolf Man, the Invisible Man, everything that we know now to this day.
Right, the original MCU.
Yeah, and you go back and watch the original MCU. You go back and watch Bela's Dracula, and is it cheesy? Yes, it's cheesy. It is a movie for the time. It's sound stages and everything that you would come to expect. But the character, it holds up to this day. The way that he played it, the way that he portrayed it, it really brought the sexy to vampires. Like, he really brought that to life, that idea that they could be seductive and alluring. And, you know, I say in my panel all the time is like, suddenly vampires weren't necessarily something you feared, but something that you wouldn't mind climbing into your room at night.
That's the problem. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And that, I feel like, was sort of the beginning of the sensual vampire.
Yeah, I think you're probably right about that. Yeah, because that's definitely when things shift that way. That Bela Lugosi's Dracula is so important. He might be the most important monster in horror ever, because to this day, if you go, I just saw a Spirit Halloween store open. And I was thinking to myself, I know if I go in there and look, they're going to have a vampire costume, which is basically the
Bela.
Dracula wardrobe from 1931, right?
Yep.
That's what a vampire is.
Yep.
And he sounds like he's from Hungary.
Yep. 1,000%. And so it's
Yeah.
funny to read that they were worried about his accent, because could you imagine going back and watching that movie now with like a New York actor?
Right.
It would be so different. And not
Right.
to downplay any of the other Draculas, because we would get a British Dracula and all
Sure. Yeah.
kinds of stuff. But the idea of that movie existing with anyone but Bela Lugosi.
Yeah. Right. Him having that accent makes him more foreign, right? It adds to that. He's this outsider. And I
Yeah.
think the funny thing about there's a lot of funny things about the 1931 film, but you could sum up the whole plot like guy from Europe moves next door to an insane asylum, is really concerned with the insane asylum's daughter's health.
Yes.
You know, that's the whole plot. Of course, he's the cause of the health problems.
Yes.
And then whatever else happens. You know what's great? My favorite part is that Lucy's still around.
Yeah.
He does not die in that movie.
Yeah.
She just runs off into the woods.
Yeah. If you
That's
go back and watch 1931, the way that we know vampires now, Dracula in 1931 was like Vampires Light. It was like just a nice, wholesome way to be introduced to the idea. And I would imagine that Bella's accent must have been so exotic at the time. We live in a world where we're able to talk to people from Australia right now if we want to. So we're exposed to so much culture and so many accents and so many things, so many languages. But imagine for many people, that is the first time hearing an authentic Hungarian accent, or, and they don't know Hungary, Transylvania, Romania, whatever. It's all the same, right? But he really, I just could not fathom a world where he was not the original Dracula.
Yeah.
Which, good for him.
Yeah,
Buried in the costume.
Yeah, he's
So
great.
we're gonna jump ahead really quick, and then we have some final thoughts, because I've already had you for 2 hours. I'm so sorry.
Yeah,
I didn't mean
it's
to take up
okay.
your Friday night, but I am absolutely loving this. So
Yeah, I'm having a great time. I'm sorry I keep talking over you.
no,
You can
Mark, this is why I
can-
had you on, for intellectual discussion. It would be terrible if you came on and said nothing, and I was just like pulling stuff out of you. I love this. So I wanted to jump ahead to Horror of Dracula in 1958, because, as you mentioned, first time the vampires burn in the sunlight, where he turns to ash, which, by the way, is one of my favorite scenes ever, when he turns to ash and it's just the two fake eyes and the two fake fangs.
Yeah, yeah. And his
love it.
his like body like blows away, and
I love it.
Yeah.
And it's also when, God bless him, Peter Cushing leaps onto the table, runs like a gymnast, flies up, grabs the curtain, rips it down, jumps back up, gets two kids. I mean, like, he was like, I was like, look how spry this man is. Like, what a showdown.
As an aside, Peter Cushing plays General Spearsdorf in The Vampire Lovers.
Yes.
And then he's Van Helsing.
Yes.
And of course, most kids today know him as Grand Moff Tarkin from Star Wars.
Sure, of course.
He's been around for a lot longer than that.
And it's funny, because when I did my month of Hammer horror, I stopped doing vampire crossovers, because the Hammer universe is like,
oh my God,
they've all been in 15 vampire, especially Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing.
Yeah.
Now, what I didn't know is they were actual real life best friends, which I think just makes me love the movies even more, because they must have had so much fun. But this was the first Hammer Dracula film. Sir Christopher Lee puts on the cape. 6'4", impressive British actor, very well trained, very, very good. And it's funny, because I did this, and it's actually going to drop in 2 days. But reviewing this one, because the first one I had reviewed prior was The Satanic Rites of Dracula in the 70s. It was horrible. It was painful to watch. So I felt like I didn't do Christopher Lee justice. So I'm like,
you didn't watch the Seven Samurais version of it?
I haven't yet. No. So I said, let's go all the way back to the first one. Much better. I feel bad. I feel like he was definitely locked into a contract.
It's hard calling it Dracula, though. Horror of Dracula. I mean, let's just say they took liberties with the source material,
Of
but
course.
I still think it's great. It's a fun movie to watch.
Love it.
Love
it.
but
It. And I love the scene when they realize that Dracula's been in the basement the whole time as they've been searching the land. He's just been in the basement. They've been leaving her with him the whole time. I love that. But this would be Christopher Lee's first time playing Dracula, and he would go down on record as being the actor to play Dracula more than any other actor. So we got to shout him out here.
Yeah.
And they famously found the cape like in some costume shop. It had been missing for 30 years, and so they found it. And so, it's one of those things that is just, it's vampire history when Christopher Lee put that cape on for the very first time. And funny, there wasn't a lot of Dracula stuff in between. But then it would kick off. Oh, it would kick off. So we're going to talk about that on our
nice
subsequent episodes, because we'll do 60s and 70s and then 80s and 90s. That's when we'll hit Bram Stoker's Dracula, and then 2000s and beyond. So we'll hit some of the stuff that has come out recently, which one of my pet peeves is when they use Dracula to punch up the script and make it scarier. I hate them willy-nilly throwing that name around. They'll just be like, and his dad was Dracula, and you're just like, come on.
Right.
But those are the things leading us into our final thoughts. Is there anything we did not talk about before I ask you these questions?
No.
Okay.
I believe we have hit everything. Did we mention that they filmed Dracula in 1931 in the day, and then they filmed it in Spanish with the same costumes and sets at night? That's a nice little fact.
That's interesting, because I just did the 1979 Nosferatu the Vampire by Werner Herzog, and they filmed it in English and then filmed it again in German. So back to back.
Well, the original one was done in and they changed the script for the Spanish version. Apparently it's a bit more sexy. They didn't think the English speaking American audience could handle it. But I guess that crazy Mexican audience could deal with it. So it's you can find that Spanish version. It's around. It's great.
I might have it.
It's if you have the collection, the Dracula collection.
Yes, the Legacy collection.
Yep, it should be the second or third movie in there.
Yep, I have it.
Yeah.
I have the Spanish version, so I'm going to watch it.
Yeah, you should. It's
okay,
great.
I'm going to watch it. Yep, I have it right here.
Yeah, that's a nice collection.
That's fun. That's interesting.
Anyway, all right.
Okay, so these are our final thoughts. So I want to ask you these questions as a learned man, as a man of education and a man of the cloth, as somebody who has done just as much unnecessary research as I have, and has just as much education that we truly don't need. Why do you think vampires are so popular?
Hold on. There's a cat. She's gone. She's just trying to get, there's a window that she's trying to get to the window, because sometimes there's bugs and mice and snakes out there, and it's fun to watch.
Oh, you're okay with that? Oh, no.
They can't come in. I don't think they can come in.
Oh, no.
They never have.
Wow.
Anyway, why do I think that vampires are, this is a question I think about often. Well, not that often, but not often enough. I think that they reflect, different times, the vampires reflect different things, right? Somebody wrote something like I think Nina Arbach, who was a academic, she said something like every generation gets the vampire that it deserves. But what she's really saying is like, our vampires always reflect what our thoughts or feelings or fears are. And from Stoker, right, having a vampire who represents what people are afraid of in the British Empire at the time.
Foreign invasion and the plague.
Yeah. And or modern vampires representing diversity and inclusion, really. Like vampires are now, we like them. They're our friends. Somebody once wrote that they're like guardian angels with fangs. But I think that because we've been able to transform the vampire to always be relevant, that it keeps going. We don't, the vampire is no longer something that people are afraid of, right? We don't like say, oh, the vampire's going to get me or whatever. It's more like if people fantasize about vampires, it's more like they want to be one than they want to avoid one because of what they're, because nowadays vampires are sexy, healthy, young, strong, nearly indestructible. And it's what people want. I always like it when we get vampires that kind of throw back to the old kind. They're not good vampires, and they don't have our best intentions at mind. They become the vampire as the way I think vampires kind of really are. They're false friends. They're not really. They're tricking us is the idea. Like they're lulling us into complacence so they can strike. They're hunters. And I like that. I like that vampire personally.
Okay.
That's my favorite. That's the kind. I like them better than Edward Cullen lover vampire,
Yeah.
but whatever. Yeah. So I think that they keep staying around because we always reinvent them to fit our needs,
Why do you think they've been around as long as they've been around? Why do you think we can trace those origins back as far as we can trace them back?
Well, I think early on, especially, the cultures have always had to struggle with death and with afterlife and with what does it mean? I think like early vampires, the Serbian and Greek ones we talked about, they're not that's not a good thing to be a vampire. It's not like, oh, I get to live longer on the earth. It's instead you're being denied heaven or whatever, right? You're being denied the afterlife. But now we flipped it, right? And we're like, no, we don't really believe in the afterlife, so we want to enjoy now as much as we can to the fullest extent. Preferably, I'm really hot and rich,
Right.
because otherwise it kind of sucks. It's like that poor vampire in True Blood who just watches TV.
Oh yeah.
And he's overweight in the first season.
It's like, well, you stay
Eddie or
what you
something.
were when you got turned, and I was
Right.
fat and lazy, and my wife
Right.
left me, and because
Here
Jason's
I am.
like, I thought all vampires were sexy, and he's like,
Right.
no.
Yeah. No. And so, but I think it's a funny way to look at it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it speaks to things that we wrestle with as a culture, as a species, a fear of death, a fear of what comes with death and the unknown. And what happens if that unknown somehow breaks into our reality? And vampires and demons and all these creatures, they all represent ways that the unknown enters into our reality. And we don't know how to deal with them. Now they also are used as metaphors, of course, for, I don't know, like no sex before marriage or something. But yeah, I think the endurance and the fact that it goes back is just, we've always had this struggle with death and dying.
Yeah. And I was going to ask you this, but I think we've kind of already hit on this, which is, what do you think are the biggest influences on the vampires we know today? So we tapped into Dracula, Carmilla. Is there anything, Varney? Is there anything we didn't touch on that you think plays a big part in the type of vampire we see today?
Yeah. Well, I kind of, in my own mind, and for my students, I sum it up kind of like the Revenant is almost like a zombie. Then we get the literature vampires. We have Polydores, who's now an aristocrat instead of a peasant. Then Carmilla is also an aristocrat. She has a fang, one.
Mhm.
Varney has 2,
Mhm.
and he's brooding, so we have that added in. So
Mhm.
each like generation we add onto it. It's not until Horror of Dracula that vampires suddenly burn up in the sun,
Mhm.
and now we take it for granted. It's 1958. That is not even 100 years ago, right?
Mhm.
70 years ago. But in our minds, that's what happens.
I know.
Um, and so that's super influential. Horror of Dracula. That one, I mean, Nosferatu. I think that there's a difference between Nosferatu and Horror of Dracula in that in Horror of Dracula, the reason why Van Helsing has to pull open the curtain is because the cross doesn't work.
Yeah.
He picks up the cross, and Dracula's just like whatever. And we see this change in Horror of Dracula from Dracula being this uh creature of evil or something spiritual to being much more carnal. The spiritual doesn't affect him anymore. Uh, it's now we have to rely on nature, like actual physical things, not supernatural,
Mhm.
the natural. And it's a shift that then ripples through because our vampires today are, by and large, you can approach them with a cross and they don't care. I've been watching that series, A Discovery of Witches,
Yes.
and the vampires in there walk around in the daytime.
Don't
I don't
have
think they have
fangs.
fangs. They like pray. They like
Yeah.
speak.
They're holy.
Like
I know.
yeah. And I'm like, yeah, okay, I'm cool with this though because I get it. I know where it's coming from.
Yeah.
I see how it operates.
Yes.
Um,
Well, and
but yeah,
sometimes we see another aspect, which is the holy item only works if you have faith. So we see
right,
the idea of faith coming back, which was
right,
very strong a long time ago,
yeah.
kind of lost its way. And now you're starting to see it a little bit again, like we saw it in Fright Night, where he's like, that doesn't work on me unless you actually believe in it.
Which is interesting because like in the novel Dracula, Jonathan Harker actually asks Van Helsing at one point, is it the cross? Is it the holy water that is effective against Dracula? Or is it because we have faith in it?
Correct.
And he's asking that question as a very good Victorian Anglican. And Van Helsing, as I'm assuming as a Catholic, is responding with the opposite idea. For Van Helsing, the object itself has power, but
Right.
for Harker, it's your belief in the object that gives it power.
Right.
But both of those things are in the novel, and neither of them are said to be the actual answer. Right? It's never really
Right.
said it. Right? So yeah, I mean,
But again, that's the beautiful thing about vampires is that vampire is whatever the person holding the pen is going to make it.
yeah,
So we're in a place now where the vampire is so widely accepted in pop culture that you can introduce anything, explain it real quick, and they'll be like, all right, in this universe, that's how it works. Like the strain. The
right.
strain
Oh, the
was
strain's a fun one. I like the strain. Yeah,
the strain was, as a nurse who worked the pandemic, was almost triggering to watch because of the way that it spread and how quickly it spread. It was almost like pulling me back into those first months of the pandemic
I
of
bet.
like, we don't know what's going on. All we know is that people are dying and we need to, that idea of it. And we see that with zombies too, like in
Yeah,
28 Days Later, that how fast it spreads, or World
yeah,
War Z. So that's the joy of that is Guillermo del Toro takes about 30 minutes to explain his vampires, and then it's off to the races. And you
yeah.
just accept it. You accept that that's
Right,
this vampire and that's the rules for this vampire. So I think
right.
that's what's so powerful about it.
Well, we have personally talked about our own problems with rules
Yes.
when they don't follow rules.
That
That really, if you have rules and you stick to the rules, I don't care. Okay, your vampire doesn't like to be in the sun because its skin sparkles. Totally dumb,
okay, fine, but that's your rule.
but you stick with it. Cool. But when you change it all around,
I know.
that's when I don't like it.
Or you get 6 books into the series and now you've changed everything. Like, wait a second,
Yeah.
hold
I
on.
thought,
I was with you. And then, yeah, and that's something my friend Jacob and I talk about is when you create the rules, I have a whole board next to me because I'm on book 5 at this point, because I have to keep track of my own rules.
Yeah, right.
Because I don't want to be that person
Right.
that changes the rules just to fit my narrative for that particular story. Like, I've written myself into that corner. That's my corner now. So that's the way
Right. That's
I've
your,
created.
you gotta, right. If the rules are consistent, that's how world building becomes more believable.
Yeah.
No matter how unbelievable the world
Correct.
might be. But if you're consistent, then you can say, oh, well, that's,
Yep.
yeah.
Those are my
So
rules. Well, Mark,
great.
I cannot thank you enough for giving me 2.5 hours on a Friday night. This was so much fun. This episode is going to air the last weekend of September, which is perfect. It's my birthday. I'll be in New Orleans. This will be getting everybody ready for spooky season. So anybody that doesn't know all the stuff we just talked about, we really have given them a Vampire 101 history lesson down and dirty to get them ready for us talking about the decades and how we even had the movies that we have in the last 100 years. So I can't thank you enough for coming on and doing this with me.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, maybe we'll have to make this an annual thing. Once a year, Professor Mark and Nurse Lena will chat about something nerdy, and it's going to be so much fun, and I love it. So thank you
Just
so,
nerdy
so
things
much.
only.
I love it. I love it. Thank you so, so much. I will let you know when this drops, and please don't hesitate to reach out if you ever need anything, but I'm very excited for spooky season, and thank you for ringing it in with me.
Happy to be a part of it.
Awesome.
All right.
Well, you have a good night.
Yeah, you too.